dear listener. I am David Tate.
And I'm Sean Powell.
And we invite you to join us as we continue talking through the text, exploring what Scripture does and doesn't say so that we can think biblically, live biblically, and be part of the solution that this world so desperately needs.
Dust off your sandals and strap on your tassels as we climb up the mountain to unlock the 5 books of Torah in Season 1, the Sinai Sessions.
Today, we're going to be talking about Genesis chapter 23, verse 1 through chapter 25, verse 18, otherwise known as Parashah Chayei Sara, or the life of Sarah, which is the 5th Torah reading section of the reading cycle thing. I'm just going to make it more awkward every single time I say it, I think. Last week, we covered Genesis chapters 18 through 22, and that in many ways brought the story of Abraham to a close. He's not going to die until the end of today's section. But in many ways, today's section is set up really for next week's section. But before we even get to all that, Sean, we got to do what we're doing every week. I'm going to give you 1 minute, and you've got to recap everything in Genesis chapters 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22.
Okay, so we're just going to do that.
Yeah, just those 5 chapters. And this one's going to be a little bit more fun. Like next week, it will be very easy for you to recap everything in 1 minute, I think, because we have a relatively uneventful section that we're discussing today. However, given the fact that last week's podcast was 3 hours long, it's safe to say you got a lot to recap. And so you're going to give us 3 hours worth of content in 1 minute. And so we're beginning with, the arrival of the 3 men to Abraham, and we're culminating with the binding of Isaac.
Okay.
You ready?
All right.
Let's see if you can do this.
Okay.
Keep in mind, he doesn't see the timer. I'm going to click time, and we're going to see how close he can get it to 1 minute.
Okay.
You ready?
All right.
3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, so these 3 men show up to Abraham while he's at his tent. It turns out that they're God. They tell Abraham that Sarah's going to conceive in a year, and Sarah laughs. And basically, then God says he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. He looks out on the town. Abraham just kind of pleads on their behalf to him. Then God goes down to Sodom and warns Lot about the destruction. He takes Lot out, he saves his family, but destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. They hide out in the mountains. And then we kind of go back to Abraham and Sarah going to a place, settling in a land where they go. There's a guy named Abimelech. They stay there. They tell him that that's her. Sorry. They say that Sarah is his sister again. And so Abimelech takes her, but God warns him in a dream not to touch her. And so he gives her back to Abraham, lets him settle in the land. They make a covenant. And then we go back to Ishmael Isaac is born. And then Sarah and Hagar have more conflict. Hagar goes out and God speaks to them and comforts them. It says that Ishmael is going to become a great nation. We go back. Abimelech and Abraham make the covenant together. And then the binding of Isaac. So Isaac and Abraham go out to this mountain, and basically Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac to God. God stops him. God blesses Abraham, and he establishes his covenant with him.
How long do you think that was?
Probably closer to 2 minutes.
That was actually exactly 1.5 minutes.
Oh, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Okay.
So that was 1 minute and 30 seconds. That was really impressive. You did that faster than last week. So
if I hadn't repeated the covenant thing twice and then hadn't stuttered as much, I might have been able to actually get it.
There you go. That was actually really impressive. Yeah. And so whenever you look at the last 2 weeks together, you really have more or less the Abraham story. Genesis chapters 12 through 22 are basically the overarching Abraham story. And then, like I said, what we're going into today is more of a, I don't want to downplay the significance of these chapters, but it really is, these are the chapters that really bridge the gap between not Abraham and Isaac so much as Abraham and Jacob, to where there is going to be one story that is devoted specifically to Isaac, and that is in next week's section. But even then, it's going to be sandwiched in between the Jacob story. And so we'll talk about that again, where even in this section, we're going to see how Isaac still continues to be a little bit of a passive character, which we did talk about last week as well. But one question that I have for you real quick before we hop into the passage itself. This is the shortest section that we're going through. And like I've been saying, I'm not the one who created the where we're sectioning things off, we're just following the weekly Torah portion that the Jewish people read through every single year. We're not reading it corresponding to what week they do it because they're at a totally different section right now. But we are following the Jewish calendar of that. And so I just wanted to ask you why you think they section this off right here. I mean, we spent like 1 week covering the first 6 chapters of Genesis, which is foundational stuff. Whereas we have an entire week dedicated to basically 2.5 chapters, and there's really only one huge story in that chapter. Why do you think it is that they have so much focus just on this one section?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really know for sure, but if I had thoughts about it off the top of my head, I would say that they could have done that to kind of to make it less awkward as far as like having a section that was like half Abraham story and then like half like Jacob, because this basically ends like right before Jacob really shows up, and so it could be that like they just kind of ended up having a short section to kind of wrap up Abraham, and then they can fully move on and focus on Jacob for the next whole reading, because I don't, like you said, I don't really think that it's not that this particular section is so dense that it requires like a shortening section to do that. But that's my best guess.
Yeah, I think it's probably just practical. And then there is probably a thematic element to it to where this section begins with the death of Sarah and it more or less ends with the death of Abraham. I mean, I know that it technically ends with the generations of Ishmael. But even with the generations of Ishmael being the end of it, well, that really brings the story of Abraham ultimately to a close because Ishmael is, the other son.
Yeah.
And then it also allows this section to end with the Toledot Ishmael, which is generations of Ishmael, and the next section begins with Toledot Isaac. And so it's the generations of Ishmael ends this section, and then officially next week we begin the next generation. And so I think it's probably just practical. I just wanted to ask that because I just find it so fascinating, because for me, if I were doing this, I would say, okay, well, let's spend a whole week on Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and then a whole week on Genesis chapter 3. And then chapters like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you can lump those all together. And then 10 and 11, like I would lump it all differently.
Yeah.
But I just found it interesting. Like whenever we were just reading through it this week, it felt like a much easier week to where I was actually getting a chance to reflect more deeply on the passages that we were covering just because we had more time with every single verse, which I thought was kind of fun. Anyways, before we actually hop into the text itself, which I already said that, but there's one game I want to play with us real quick. And this is going to sound kind of weird, and it is kind of weird, but it's because I don't think I ever truly appreciated, and appreciated probably is not the appropriate word here. I don't think I fully realized how truly incestuous Abraham's family was until this read through. I mean, I knew that it was kind of weird. And also you got to realize ancient times, different culture, different customs, but it's weird, man. And it's not going to stop here. And this kind of just ties into a theme that I usually try to remind people of whenever you go to the book of Genesis. Don't go to Genesis if you're wanting life lessons on how to have a healthy family. You go to Genesis to learn what it means to live by faith, and you just got to take the family baggage with it. Because like I've said before, Genesis is a soap opera, right? It is dramatic. It is crazy. There are weird relationships. And so what I want to do real quick is, and then we're going to get to the actual text itself.
Yeah.
I'm going to list out 2 characters from the book of Genesis, and I just want you to guess what the relationship with each other is. And these are all from the family of Terah, right? Which is Abraham's father. And so I'm going to start off hopefully kind of easy. And then we're going to start getting into some ones that are either weirder or harder for you to guess. And so let's just start off with Abraham and Sarah. So they're husband and wife, but how are they actually related to one another?
They'd be step siblings.
They're step siblings. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's kind of weird, right? They have the same father, not the same mother. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's talk about Nahor and Milcah. So Milcah is Milcah is the grandmother of Rebekah, who we're going to see today. So Rebekah is the daughter of Bethuel, and Bethuel is the son of Nahor and Milcah. Nahor is Abraham's brother. How are Nahor and Milcah related?
Oh boy. It's a lot to... Okay, so Nahor had kids with You said Beulah?
Bethuel is the son of Nahor. He had a bunch of kids
Gotcha,
with
gotcha.
Milcah.
Gotcha.
I had to like sketch this all out. I had to
Yeah.
write a whole family tree here. I can't. I don't want to say I found it funny, but I did because it was like this is just crazy to wrap your mind around. Okay, so Nahor and Milcah,
Yeah.
they're married to each other. We're just trying to figure out what their relationship is. You can just, if you just don't know, you just can say that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, they are uncle and niece.
Oh.
And that's because Nahor is the son of Terah, and there was Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, right? Remember, Haran is the son who died before Abraham went down, right, to Canaan. Well, Haran, we mainly know him because he was the father of Lot, but we also know that Haran was also the father of Iscah and Milcah. And it doesn't explicitly say that the Milcah, who is the daughter of Haran, is the same Haran that was the brother of Nahor, but it's in the same passage. And so you would expect it to clarify, if not.
Yeah.
And so it seems like Iscah and Milcah were sisters of Lot, in which case Milcah was the niece of Nahor, and then they married each other, and then they had all these kids. All right. Which then leads us to the couple that we're going to talk about today, Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac is the son of Abraham, and Rebekah is the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Nahor and Milcah. So, this is where it's okay. If Milcah is the niece of Nahor, who is the brother of Abraham, who is the step-sibling of Sarah, and together they had Isaac, how does that make Isaac and Rebekah related?
They cousins?
They are first cousins once removed.
Okay.
Because it's a slightly different generation, right? So,
Yeah.
so Isaac would be direct cousins with Bethuel, but Rebekah is the daughter of Bethuel. And so they're first cousins once removed, and that would be the same true with being like Laban as well. And so there's that. And then there's just this other one I had to throw in there because we talked about it last week. How does Lot relate to his grandchildren?
Oh, like he's their dad.
He's their dad. And how does he relate to his daughters?
Their husband?
He's their husband. Yeah. It's
Kind of.
kind of. It's for that one, I just wrote yuck in the relationship because it's just
Yeah.
all sorts of messed up. And so if you ever wondered about the incestuous family tree of Abraham, there's that. And it's only going to get weirder because by the end of Genesis, we're going to have Jacob, who is married to two sisters and their maidservants, and they're all having kids together. And they were already slightly related distantly before they got married because those two sisters are going to be the daughters of Laban, who he is like also related to. And
yeah,
so
that's his uncle, huh?
yeah, something like that. I haven't worked that out yet. I ran out of room in the family tree, so I'll get there eventually. But yeah. So long story short, Abraham's family is kind of wackadoodle. But if God can use them, man, he can use any of us. That does not endorse any of that stuff. I just felt like
Just
we had
to
to highlight
clarify.
that. Yeah. I just had to highlight that because as I was reading through this, I was like, wait a second. Milcah, I've heard of her. And I was having to work it all out in my head. And
Yeah.
yep. So there's that. On a lighter note, let's talk about death.
Nice.
I'm in a weird mood today. So Genesis chapter 3 is where, not 3, Genesis chapter 23 is where we're picking up today. And the reason why this section is called the Chayei Sara is because that means the life of Sarah. And the section begins with Sarah's death. So the first words are, and Sarah lived, which is where we get the phrase Chayei Sara. And so, Sean, will you just summarize to us what happens in this chapter?
Yeah. Long story short, Sarah dies. Abraham needs to find a place to bury her, and he buys a place to bury her.
There you go. That was a nice summary. Like I said, next week is going to be super easy for you. I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to summarize everything. So Sarah dies. Abraham needs a place to bury her. He buys a place to bury her. The question becomes, why do we need a whole chapter devoted to it? And so, follow-up question to you, why is this chapter significant?
Because it goes back to Genesis 12, where God promised Abraham land, and thus far, Abraham has not owned land. The only thing he's had so far is a well.
Yeah.
And so this, and we'll talk about this as we go through the chapter, but this whole chapter is really as detailed as it is because it is showing how Abraham is legitimately acquiring land. So this is a direct fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham, which makes sense because this is like the bookend of his story.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you can really see right from the get-go in this chapter how we are preparing things for the next generation. right? So chapter 22 ended. We didn't even talk about this in the main podcast. We talked about this in the after show, but chapter 22 ended not just with the binding of Isaac, but it actually culminated with the announcement that Abraham's family up in the land they came from had also had kids, right? And we hear the announcement of Rebekah. And so we're getting our eyes focused on the next generation. And then you flip to chapter 23 and it says, and Sarah lived 127 years and she died. And so we realize, oh, okay. So the first generation is passing away. And so now that his wife is dead, Abraham is really setting his focus on preparing things for his son Isaac. And so that the first step in doing that is acquiring a cave where their family can be buried.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is like a necessarily more culturally significant, but I feel like there is something to be said about the fact that it's not just a house that they're buying, it's specifically a burial place. Like to me, there's a strong association with like having a place where people are buried and being like a permanent settlement. Like versus, because even a house can be like a dwelling that like moves place to place, but like a tomb, that's like a permanent place, and it's like you're now associating that land with like, this is our land.
Yeah, well, you associate it with your home, right? I mean, there are people who they will spend their entire life traveling all around the world, yet when they die, they want to be buried in their hometown.
Yeah.
And they want their ashes scattered in the place that like they call home. And you see that even to this day. And so I think that there is an element to that, to where it's not like he's not just buying any land just to build a house. He's buying a place for his, like, whenever the people of Israel are gathered to their people, they're being gathered to the land of Canaan, right? And so I think that there's something relevant to that, just not just in that culture, but also in our culture even to this day, but even more so in an ancient culture when they just had a lot more rituals in regards to burial and stuff than we do. Like, they treated it as a more sacred thing.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. But yeah, and so Sarah dies, and so she lives 127 years, which means that at the time that she dies, Abraham is 137 years old, which would mean that Isaac is 37 years old at this point. Just to kind of give us an idea of where we're at in the story. We talked about how in chapter 22, we did not know how old Isaac was, but we had good reason to think that he's probably at the very least in his late teens, but maybe even into his mid-20s, like some traditions say mid-20s and stuff. But we do know at least right here at the beginning of chapter 23, he's 37. And that's because Abraham had him when he was 100 and Sarah was 90. And so if you just do the math, he's 37 years old. And so she died in Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn to Sarah and to weep for her. This is just a side thing. I don't really think anything of this. I wasn't even planning on bringing this up. I have a friend who he has a very strong opinion about this passage because he says, specifically when it says, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. His theory is that Abraham and Sarah were separated at this point, and so Abraham had to come to her to weep for her. What do you think about that?
I guess I hadn't really thought about the fact that it does say came to mourn for Sarah and weep for her. And I guess you could take that literally to be like she died over here and he like came over to like oh crap, my wife's dead.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
there's really nothing else that would imply that, but
yeah, I guess like the only thing would be that if you go a few verses earlier, chapter 22, it says, and Abraham lived, this is verse 19, it says, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. And then you have chapter 23, and Sarah died in Kiriath Arba. And there's only a few verses of separation there. But the main thing that I would push back on is decades have passed, and Abraham is a nomad who wanders around, and he's a sojourner.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know. Anytime that he's brought it up, like he has a very strong opinion, and like I've heard him like go on like long things about it. I don't necessarily hold to that. I mean, I guess it is a possible interpretation, but I feel like that might be reading too much into the text and suggesting that there's like familial strife that is not there. And believe me, there is plenty of familial strife. And Abraham is far from the perfect husband, and Sarah is far from the perfect wife. But I don't necessarily see that as suggesting that they're at odds.
Yeah, I don't really see anything else here. I feel like that would be a pretty significant thing.
Yeah.
Especially because, I mean, I guess they'd both be like in the land still, so it wouldn't be like the same as like, you know, one of them returning back to like their father's house.
Yeah. Yeah. And and to be fair, I've never heard anybody else have that interpretation. That's why it's always stuck out to me, because I'm like, I don't think there's anything there. So I just
Yeah.
thought that was an interesting interpretation to throw out there.
Yeah.
Anyways, the main thrust of this story is actually not even Sarah's death and not even Abraham's mourning. It's actually the direct aftermath of that, where Abraham approaches the Hittites, also known as the sons of Heth, and he says, hey, I would like to buy this cave on this field, and I would like to buy the field as well, and I would like to bury my wife in it. And basically it's going to be this family burial. And you kind of addressed this, but what is the significance behind them needing this land, or even beyond that? Because it's tied to the covenant. Why do you think it's so significant reading through the text? Keep in mind, we have one whole chapter dedicated to the creation of the universe.
Yeah.
We have 11 chapters dedicated to thousands of years of history. We have a whole chapter right here that is dedicated to a back and forth conversation between people negotiating about real estate prices.
Yeah.
Why does the author feel the need to slow down and emphasize this back and forth interaction? Because, he could just say, if this were earlier on, you would almost expect him to say, and Abraham struck a deal with Ephron the Hittite, he purchased the cave, and he buried Sarah. Like, you could easily summarize that in that way. Why does the author go into so much work to detail exactly what went on here?
Yeah. I'd say there's at least two probably worth mentioning reasons. The first reason, as we kind of talked about, is the fact that when you break down like what's going on here, because whenever you read it, the people he's talking to, they want to just give him the land. And so as you go through, you realize that Abraham is the one pushing to actually pay for this land. And you realize that it just, as it goes on, there's this big emphasis on like witnesses and paying for this land. And you get the idea that this becomes like, the focus is that this becomes a very legitimate business deal. And so for multiple reasons, this is a fulfillment of the covenant, because it's just showing how Abraham is legitimately acquiring land, and how this is something that basically, like, going forward, like, this is land that he will own, and they can't go back on that and be like, oh, well, we gave you the land so we can take it back. Yeah. And also, I think that it's probably worth mentioning that when there's these type of interactions like this, they're also always giving insight into people's characters. And so, kind of like with Abraham bargaining with God, if you want to use the word bargain, back in 18. Likewise here, when Abraham is having this interaction with these Hittites, you're directly seeing his character, similar to how, again, not in the Torah, but later on we'll talk about like King David, the way that he will buy the land for the Temple Mount and stuff, or not Temple Mount for a long time, but the way he'll buy the land in Jerusalem, where he will say, like, I will not, like, the way that he, like, because it wouldn't be sinful for him to just take the land, because it's offered to him for free. Yeah. Same thing here. I don't think Abraham would be necessarily sinning if he just like took the land, but the fact that he insists on a cost and paying for it, that does speak about his character and how he's viewing the entire world that he's living in and the things that he's doing. The fact that he's viewing things through a covenant lens, and specifically acquiring this land because of what God promised him.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, I guess, from a practical perspective, since Genesis is so foundational, and this ties into what you were talking about with David, you're learning what the expectation is. Like we've established in chapter 22, Abraham has learned to hear the voice of God. Yeah. Like his character arc is complete. And so what we're seeing here is a man functioning as a devoted follower of Yahweh. Mm-hmm. And so the question becomes, what does it look like to be a devoted follower of Yahweh? Mm-hmm. And like David, Abraham seems to be of the opinion that he wants it to cost him something, right? God has given him these things. Like, he has blessed him tremendously. He has all this wealth, and it is not his job to hoard this wealth for himself. It is his job to distribute this wealth and to use what God has given him in such a way to either advance the covenant, to bless others, and to do all that stuff, and to live by faith. And so it seems like with David, the whole thing is, he says, I don't want to accept this for free, right? I want to pay. I want this to cost me something, because that's what God deserves. And so it seems like Abraham's doing that. But then practically speaking, it makes it to where it's basically the ancient equivalent of a contract, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, back in the day, like whenever like writing actually became like, we got to keep in mind that cultures have not always been literate, and they have certainly not been as literate as we are nowadays.
Yeah.
But especially at this time period, writing was just not like if you actually just look into the history at this time period, I don't even think writing had fully developed, really. I mean, maybe in Egypt at this point.
Mhm.
I'd have to like look up the exact dates,
Yeah.
but
Very, very rare bits, like,
Yeah.
bits of hieroglyphics, and it would be usually like either very like royal edicts, or it'd be like some business deals and stuff.
to where by the time you get to the Moses' time period, it's become more prevalent, but even then, it's still mainly amongst like royalty and nobility.
Mhm.
And Abraham would kind of fit into that category, but the thing is, we're still so early on that writing was just not a super common thing. For us nowadays, you can't download an app without having to check off the terms and agreements. And the whole reason you have to do that is because the app wants to make sure that you can't sue them, and you also have to make sure that they can't do anything back to you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's how agreements work. And so this is the ancient equivalent of accepting the terms and agreements,
Yeah.
to where the author is emphasizing Abraham purchased this fair and square.
Mhm.
And they tried giving it to him, but Abraham is smart enough to realize, if y'all give this to me freely, there's nothing that stops y'all from just taking it back,
Mhm.
because you could claim that it was always yours and you were just loaning it to me.
Yeah.
And so that's why they like, there's like this back and forth to where they're like, hey, just take it. Come on. Like, this is nothing. It's just a small cave. And he says, no. I need to pay for it. And there's like, no, we want to give it to you. He's like, no, I'm going to pay for it.
Yeah.
And so they're like, okay, well, 400 shekels. He's like, here's the 400 shekels. And then it emphasizes that there are witnesses there and everything, because it's emphasizing this was a legitimate deal. He has purchased the land, and now it officially gives Abraham a foothold in the land of Canaan, so that he does now have a legitimate claim on the land, because he is now one of the possessors of it, which will be relevant to his people 400 years later, because this land is never going to go out of, like it's still their property, to where even at the end of Genesis, whenever they're living in the land of Egypt, they're still traveling into Canaan to bury people in the land. And so the idea is that they still have that possession, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Or you gonna say something?
There's another thing too, to just kind of connect it back to like earlier stories where you may have already said this, but also there's also the whole thing here where if you go back to, is it 14 with where Abraham
Melchizedek?
with Melchizedek,
Or in the King of Sodom, I guess.
Yeah, more specifically the king of Sodom, where after, he goes and rescues Lot, and the kings want to give him stuff. If you remember, Abram at this point, basically just says, I will not take anything because I don't want anyone to say that they made me rich, because God promised him that he would make him a mighty nation and give him wealth and stuff. And so I guess you could say the same thing here. By purchasing the land, if God gave him the wealth, then he's, like you said, he's using what God gave him. Then God's the one kind of behind all this. Whereas, again, I don't really think him taking the land that they give him would be a bad thing in and of itself. But it shows you kind of just the kind of like the way that the people who hear God's voice, the way they operate. It's not just about what is lawful and unlawful.
Yeah.
It's about how, the implications of things and how things look, and also just how it affects, your own conscience and stuff.
Sorry.
Well, just you see this like in bits and pieces as we go on. Again, like how with King David, you foreshadow by saying he's a man after God's own heart, and so then you see how that worked, like how what you view his life through the lens of he's a man after God's own heart. Here you see God say, now I know you hear my voice. And so you're supposed to read through the lens of, this is a guy who hears God's voice.
Yeah. And in addition to all that, if they had just given it to him free of charge, we know that oftentimes that's not how gifts work. I mean, hypothetically, in an ideal world, that is how it would work, right? Oh, I'm just giving this to you out of the kindness of my heart. But usually there is always, okay, now you're in my debt. And so if they had given this to him freely, it would put Abraham in a place where he is kind of subordinate to the Hittites now.
That's true.
To where it puts him underneath them. And now it's almost like it could be, again, you're talking about like the implications of how it looks. It almost looks like he's immersing himself into their nation, to where it's kind of like later on whenever we're going to see the people of Shechem after the whole assault of Dinah. how they're going to say, oh, well, if you get circumcised, then we can mix together. It's not, it's like kind of the idea of like mixing the cultures to where Abraham is now almost melding into them. And Abraham was like, no, that is not happening. There's like this, he's creating this distinction to where he is not going to be subordinate to them. He is going to use what God has given him, and he's going to purchase it fair and square. And now that actually gives him a legal claim amongst the nations. So not only does he own land, but now that he owns family land where his family can be buried, he is now officially the father of a nation. Yeah. If that makes sense. To where there's the sons of Heth, and now officially there is the sons of Abraham. If that kind of makes sense. Where now he's officially a nation now, because you can't be a nation if you don't have land. He now has land. He is now a nation.
That's true.
We're going to add something?
Yeah, just one more thing on top of all that. Just as far as like us talking about this particular story, but in the very beginning, it says that they recognize him as like a prince of God, and just kind of a little thing here of we realize that they're basically like they're recognizing him as having a great name, like God gave him, and so we see that God's blessing him in that way, but also them offering him the land. It's probably similar to again with the David story, but like the idea that kings and princes, as we will later on read, and actually as we have read earlier, they tended to take, and so it wouldn't be that Abraham really takes if he is taking this land, like if they're giving it to him, but I think there is still this idea of Abraham has the ability to take, but chooses not to, and he chooses to actually make it cost him something, and so again, this is still just kind of. It is still kind of giving insight into the character of someone who hears God.
Yeah. And that is directly parallel to Genesis 14 with the whole, he refuses to take from the king of Sodom, but he gives to Melchizedek.
Yeah, that's true.
So were you done talking there? I can go off again. Okay. But yeah, so you are learning a person who hears the voice of God, they're not so quick to take for themselves. Instead, they are more than willing to give to others at great cost to themselves. Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, we were talking about this before we filmed the podcast. Yeah. We were having to do a little deep dive. How much is 400 shekels, Sean?
We don't know.
We don't exactly know. So this is one of those things where we have to realize that ancient currencies do not function the same way as modern currencies do. To where, I've got like $1, and that dollar is pretty much fixed as a price. But even then, it's always fluctuating based on like inflation and stuff, to where theoretically, $1 always equals $1. But the price, like
the purchasing power,
the purchasing power changes back and forth, to where you could buy a lot more for $1 3 decades ago than you can nowadays.
I imagine there's probably less inflation going on like during the ancient times, as like seriously, but yeah, I'm sure it still happened.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you compare the Old Testament to the New Testament, Joseph is sold for 20 pieces of silver, and Jesus is sold for 30 pieces, and so there's inflation, but that's over thousands of years. So it could be like the same idea, but a shekel is a unit of weight. Mm-hmm. And so we were doing a deep dive here because I have heard people talk about how much a shekel actually is. And you hear all sorts of different things, to where I've heard people say that a shekel is a day's wage, and I've heard people say that a shekel is a year's wage. And it seems like basically nobody can fully agree. And really the main issue is because since it is a weight, it really would vary based on where you're at, because it also depends on how valuable that weight is. Like, if you're dealing in silver, how valuable is silver in the place you're at? Like whenever you look at the time of Solomon, it says that silver was as common as, like stones.
Yeah.
Okay, so silver doesn't hold much weight at that time period because it was so prosperous. Mm-hmm. And so there is going to be inflation and stuff like that, but you're dealing with weights, and so you really don't know exactly what the exchange rate is. And so the best resource I could find, they were suggesting that whenever you compare like to contemporary accounts, because the Bible doesn't just give us a clear outline for here's these measurements. I know that our Bibles will throw like tables of measurements in the very back. But sometimes they're not always that accurate. But the best resource I could find, just like scanning through it over the course of a few minutes, is that they were suggesting that over in Babylon and like Persia, that area, around this time period, it would have been roughly 2 shekels. What was it, a month? Is that what we said?
Yeah.
And so you'd have received 2 shekels a month, in which case 400 shekels is 200 months' wages. And so if you're going by like an American standard, if you're going with like $40,000 a year, that would basically be $670,000 ish of money. Which sounds like a lot of money to me, but to Abraham that's probably nothing. I mean, because Abraham's rich, and that seems to be what the guy says, what Ephron says. He says, or actually, this brings up one final thing I want to talk about before we can probably move on to the next chapter. This is just a weird passage that we were also talking about before we started filming.
Yeah.
So you got this back and forth between Ephron and Abraham. Verse 14, it says, "Then Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, 'My Lord, hear me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver, what is that between me and you? So bury your dead.'" And so when I read that, it makes it sound like Ephron is still pushing back. And he is saying, dude, come on. We're both rich. This land, it's not worth that much. Which, again, $670,000 sounds like a lot to me.
Yeah.
But he says, this land is not worth that much between us. And it seems like he's saying, just take it. But then it says in verse 16, "And Abraham heard Ephron. And Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, commercial standard." And then he gives it to him. I even love that the phrase commercial standard there is that they're even acknowledging that it was like whatever the rate was at that time period. Like that's what we're dealing with. So I have my theory behind what's going on here, and you might agree with me, but it seems to me like Ephron says, dude, you don't have to pay me 400 shekels. It's only worth 400 shekels. And Abraham's like, okay, I hear you. And then he gives him money, which seems like Abraham didn't hear him. What do you think's going on there?
Yeah. When I first read it, I wasn't really sure how to read it, because like you said, it definitely sounds like he's kind of like downplaying, which, to be fair, I guess from like a businessman standpoint, like I guess you would kind of like downplay. It's like, oh, he names a price, and whether it's a high or low price, he kind of like downplays it, like, oh yeah, this is like almost like a steal for like the land that you're getting. And so like Abraham agrees to it, but yeah, exactly like what his like tone and facial expression looks like and what he actually is saying, because as you said, like it says he heard Ephron, which makes it sound like if Ephron sounds like he's giving it to him, and Abraham heard Ephron, you'd think he would just take the land, but then he pays for it, which to me makes it seem like if Abraham is hearing Ephron and paying for it, that Ephron's actually asking him to pay for it.
Yeah.
This is another example of just like you kind of had to be there.
Yeah. Well, I think it ties into the theme that we've been talking about like seeing and hearing.
Yeah.
To where we know that Abraham has learned to hear the voice of God. And it seems like because he hears God correctly, he knows how to hear other people correctly as well, to where you just see that I think he's wise. And so this is one of those things where if we were there, I imagine that the conversation would be like, the emotion behind it would be very evident.
Yeah.
To where Ephron's like, my friend, I would give this to you for free. Because believe me, it's only worth 400 shekels. What is that between me and you? And Abraham's like, I hear you. 400 shekels? Okay. And like, he pays it off, to where, this would be like the place where, like, you got these two businessmen who are talking back and forth. And in many ways, it's almost like one businessman is gauging whether or not the other guy can actually afford it.
Oh,
to where he's like, oh, well, I mean, this house, I mean, it's only $2 million. And then like, he's trying to figure out if that's going to make the guy run away. And then all of a sudden the guy just pulls $2 million out of his back pocket. And he's like, oh, okay. Like, you actually get paid for it.
Yeah.
Like, it seems like that's kind of what's going on, to where
I can see that. Yeah.
To where everyone's like, dude, I would give this to you. And it's almost like he's saying, like, I doubt you could pay for it. And he's like, I mean, if we're having this conversation, so come on, 400 shekels, that's nothing. And Abraham's like, oh no, I actually can pay for it. And so I feel like there's probably like some Middle Eastern businessman strategy going on here. I just find that kind of funny, because it's like, and Abraham heard. It's like, he knew what was going on. Is there anything else you want to add into just the conversation about that whole chapter?
Not really. Not that I could think of. Maybe it's just worth noting that this cave is near. It says facing Mamre. I don't know if that means that it's like adjacent to it, or if it just means like what does that mean by facing Mamre?
I don't know. It's just like, I think it's literally toward the face of. So I think it's just, I don't know. Like maybe that's the direction that the cave opening was towards. I'm not sure. Like I was wondering that, but I don't really know if there's anything that can give us clear and like
Yeah.
yeah.
Which either way, I don't know if that really mean much. Mamre is the place he was staying at back in 14
Yeah.
when he was staying with the Amorites that he had a covenant with.
Yeah, because Mamre was, I think he's a person,
Yeah.
right? Because it's like the oak of Mamre. Like it's a person. He had this tree, and Abraham liked hanging out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know.
Mamre, the Amorites, or whoever.
Yeah.
Um,
Anyways,
yeah.
so yeah, so I don't have an answer for that. Let's go into chapter 24. That is the longer chapter. It is actually the longest chapter in the book of Genesis, and I really like this chapter. Like it's weird. I know that ancient cultures didn't exactly do romance the same way we do. And this is an arranged marriage right here, which you would not expect to be the description of a romance story.
Yeah.
And Isaac isn't even a main character in the story, but there's something about this chapter that I have just always found so romantic. I think it's honestly just because it almost feels like an extended version of what you read in Genesis chapter 2 with God providing a helper for man.
Yeah.
To where we see God providing a helper for Isaac, but it's like this long drawn out story where it's like all these things working together perfectly, and it's just such a sweet story. And so, can you just summarize the entire story for us?
Yeah. So basically, Abraham needs to get a wife for Isaac. He sends his servant to go back to his father's house to get a wife, and he does that.
There you go.
Yeah. He gets a wife, and he comes back, and
Yeah, and in the midst of all this, we see how God miraculously provides it, right? And so we'll talk about this at the end. But I, in many ways, think that, or actually, before we get to that, let me just ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think it is that the servant is not named in this story?
It's a good question. I guess I hadn't actually thought about that because I guess we probably assume it's Eleazar, but we don't know.
Yeah, that's what most Jewish tradition holds it to because we have had Eleazar mentioned way earlier. To be fair, a lot of time has passed. Eleazar might not even be around anymore. Because if you go back to, that was last time we heard about Eleazar was Genesis chapter 15, which was before the birth of Isaac, before the birth of Ishmael. So we're dealing with 60 years earlier. And that was Eleazar was the head of Abraham's household at the time. And Abraham was concerned that Eleazar might be his heir. Mm-hmm. Whereas at this point, decades have passed. Isaac is 40 years old. We don't know where Eleazar's at, but Jewish tradition does typically hold that this is Eleazar who is doing this. But my question to you is, why do you think that he isn't named?
Yeah, I guess there could be a number of reasons. One could just be simply that as a reader, we're supposed to focus more on like the action versus like who this is about. Mm-hmm. And I guess also, if you're reading this, by making the name, like the story itself is like still as real as it would be if he was named, but like by making his name kind of like a more like just like the servant or the slave. How do I word this? Like whenever like we're reading it or like Israelites are reading this, they can almost like not generalize the story, but like they can see like how like the ideal like slave or servant is to be. It's like it's not just ooh, Eleazar is a cool dude. It's like, oh no, this is like how like the slave needs, like how the servant needs to be. And so like you're kind of almost like it is almost like more applicational in that sense. Like you're reading it and you're like seeing that this is like how not just this one guy is, but like this is how like all servants should be. Yeah.
This chapter in many ways, because of how general it is with the language, it feels like the easiest chapter to turn into a sermon. Just because to me, it's, we believe it's a historical story that actually took place, but the way that certain details are recounted, it reads almost like a fable or something like that, to where there is a lesson that you're learning in the midst of all of it. And it seems like the author is intentionally wanting you to learn those lessons to where as I was copying it, the words that kept popping up again and again are Ebed, which is Hebrew for slave or servant, and Adonai or my Lord. Right.
Yeah.
And so, or translated my master, right? For whenever it's referring to a human master, they usually just call it master, but it's the same word that, Abraham uses to speak of God. So Lord. And so kind of like what you're saying, I can't help but think that the reason why the name isn't put here is because if you're an ancient Israelite reading this for the first time, you're learning what it looks like to be a slave serving a master correctly. And keep in mind, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. They have been freed from Egypt. They have been brought to Mount Sinai to become God's possession. So they are free, but now they are slaves of a good master.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't help but think that an ancient Israelite is supposed to read this, and you can't help but just be amazed by how good of a servant this guy is, to where at the end of this whole discussion, I have got 18 things that I have written down. Like, I didn't even know what number I was going to land at. Originally, I was going to try to hit for like 12, because 12 is a good biblical number. I was like, I'm going to find 12 qualities about this slave that just present him as the ideal slave. But as I was reading through it, I kept finding more and more and more. And so this guy really, he's probably one of the best characters that we've seen so far. It probably helps that we don't know everything about him, right? Abraham, we get to see his warts and all, because we get to see both like his best moments and his worst moments.
Yeah.
Whereas this guy, we really just get this one moment with him, and he crushes it from beginning to end. And so let's just begin walking through the story.
Yeah.
And along the way, we'll just have different stuff to talk about. But I guess even before we walk through it, why does this story matter? Like what is the significance of this? We talked about why it's important that Sarah died, why it's important that we bought a cave. This is the longest chapter, right? We have more attention devoted to this random slave acquiring a wife for Isaac than we had devoted to the entire creation of the universe.
Yeah.
Why is there so much attention devoted to this?
Yeah. I'm not like, that's a good question. I do think that there are multiple reasons, of course. Like, and I guess most of them would be like addressed as we read through, but like the fact that he sends someone to go back to his father's house to grab a wife, and the fact that it also kind of gives insight into Rachel's character, Rebecca. The fact that it gives insight into Rebecca's character before she really comes back. It kind of introduces some characters. And so it is definitely an important chapter for that reason, just because of, like, if you're looking at the narrative of the story so far, the whole thing is that Abraham has a promised seed. And so he has the son, but the next obvious thing is we need a woman who's going to bear sons. And so, like, Rebecca is like almost, if anything, almost equally as important to this covenant as Isaac is. Because what Isaac represents is like the kind of the pinnacle of this covenant, but at the same time, just Isaac with no helper is not complete.
Yeah. It'd be one thing if Isaac was the Messiah, right? If Isaac was the promised one who was going to crush the head of the serpent, well, then we're like, okay, cool. He's significant in and of himself. But as we've pointed out, Isaac is very much a passive character, to where the main significance that he plays in the book of Genesis is the confirmation of the covenant to Abraham.
Yeah.
Because you have this huge buildup to Isaac's character. He shows up and he just kind of feels like a disappointment, to where he really doesn't feel like his own character. And I feel like that's intentional, right? Obviously, Isaac was a person who lived a long time. He had all these stories that could be told about him. But the author intentionally, and we talked about this last week, he kind of makes us feel deflated when it comes to Isaac, to where you're reading the story and you're like, man, I thought like he had all this potential and he's just kind of there. And so I would agree with you that Rebecca, she plays the same role as Isaac, to where since Isaac is not the Messiah, the main function that Isaac has to the story is producing another seed who might be the Messiah. But he cannot produce another seed until he has a wife. And so if the dramatic tension in Abraham's life is where his son is going to be born, then the dramatic tension in Isaac's story is where his wife is going to be found.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just because that's the big question here. Whereas Abraham starts off the story with a wife. And then the question is, how do two old barren people have a kid? Whereas Isaac, he's 40 years old. He don't have a wife. And the question becomes, well, how do you have a kid in a nation if you don't have a wife?
Yeah.
And so that would seem to be the tension there. Another thing that might be, like, it might even tie to this whole idea of Isaac being a disappointment, is that if you contrast Abraham and Jacob, Abraham is this amazing figure of faith who is very flawed. Whereas Jacob is a very flawed figure who has a little bit of faith. To where Abraham, in many ways, you see that he is Like if you got this whole like seed of the woman, seed of the serpent thing going on, Abraham is like 95% towards the seed of the woman, but he's got like 5% serpent-like qualities to where every now and then he will mess up and he'll really screw things up. Whereas Jacob, he comes out of the womb grabbing heels. He is the serpent through and through, and it's only by God's faithfulness that he is delivered from himself and finds himself in the covenant. And so you've got these two characters who are bookending the story, and they both represent types of faith, but neither of them are like fully in, fully out, right? Abraham messes up, but he succeeds. Jacob, he messes up a lot and succeeds a little bit. And in the middle, you would expect Isaac to fit this role of maybe like a paragon of one or the other. But instead, you've got this like servant character, and he's unnamed. And I can't help but feel like that is intentional, because it seems like if the whole book of Genesis is teaching you what it looks like to live by faith, well, this guy, I mean, we're in the very middle of the book, right? There's 50 chapters in Genesis. We're right here in the center of the book. It is the longest chapter. You've got this unnamed servant whose story begins and ends with faith, to where he sets out, and the only reason his mission has a chance of success is because of God's faithfulness to Abraham. And so he leaves in faith. He arrives, and he says, God, I'm going to entrust you to make this mission succeed.
Yeah.
And every single step he makes, every single word he speaks, it's all by faith, by faith, by faith. And by the end, he's inviting Rebekah to also live by faith. And he's inviting Rebekah's family to also live by faith. And so you've got Abraham over here, who is 95% seed of the woman, 5% seed of the serpent. You got Jacob over here, who is 95% seed of the serpent, 5% seed of the woman. And you've got this one guy in the middle who is just like this paragon of absolute faith. And he's not Isaac. He's not anybody significant to the story. He is simply a side character who chose to serve Abraham, right? And to bless Abraham. And I can't help but feel like there is an inherent like application to that, to the people of Israel, and also to us, to where we realize that this servant is supposed to be what all of us are called to be, right? We're called to be people who live by faith, and we live by faith in the covenant that God made to Abraham, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so to me, if you're just looking at like the structure of Genesis, it feels like this is like, I know that the way that we structure books nowadays is like, a 3-act story towards like, there's this opening thing and then it builds to a climax and there's a quick resolution. Whereas I'm not arguing that Genesis is like a chiasm that meets in the middle, but whenever you do look at a lot of ancient books, especially in like the Middle East, a lot of the times one of their big like climaxes does come near the middle of the story. And this story is, I don't know, it's just like,
it is in the middle. Yeah.
It's just this random unnamed guy to where the hero of our story so far, and the person arguably throughout Genesis, other than maybe Joseph, who gives off the impression of being the most faithful, is not a person whose name that we know. Like the author intentionally leaves his name out of history. It's not Abraham, not Isaac, not Jacob, not Judah, not even Joseph. It's some random slave.
Yeah.
I kind of think that's cool, to where, I don't know, I want to know this guy's name, but it's also kind of cool that we don't. And I can't help but think that there's a relevance to that. But
yeah, it's like he gave Abraham a name, but like a name for himself, but then he like didn't give the servant like a name.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but
yeah. Well, the servant was content to help Abraham, or the servant was content to play his part in serving God in making Abraham's name great. And that was enough for him. And that's kind of cool. Like that's neat. Anyways, we go into the chapter itself, and the chapter opens up with probably the verse that makes it absolutely clear that Abraham's story is coming to an end.
Yeah.
It just says, "Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and Yahweh had blessed Abraham in every way." That's basically how you know his story's over. We're moving on to a next generation.
Yeah.
And so Abraham calls his oldest servant to him. And this is the servant that he had placed over all that he owned. And he says, "Put your hand under my thigh," which it's a very intimate thing. We don't do that nowadays. But the idea is you're putting your hand under the thigh. It represents like the loins, where future seed comes from, right? So he's making a promise that will not affect just Abraham, but the future generations. And he asks the servant to leave the land of Canaan and go to the land of the forefathers where they came from, and to acquire a wife for Isaac. And the servant responds and says, suppose that the woman is not willing to follow me to this land. Should I indeed take your son back to the land from where you came? And Abraham says, beware lest you take my son back there. Yahweh, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kin, and who spoke to me and who swore to me, saying, to your seed I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you will take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. My question to you, why do you think Abraham is so adamant that Isaac should not leave the land? Like, he seems very clear about this. Why?
Yeah, I would say off the bat 2 reasons, and one is more practical, and one is more like not necessarily less practical, but of just like what did it represent. As he references in his response to his servant, in Genesis 12, the whole thing was that God was calling him from his father's house. And so he was supposed to leave all that behind because he is now focusing on this land in Canaan. And now he's there and he has this son. And so if his son goes back to get a wife, it is like a reversal of that covenant,
Mm-hmm.
where basically you have him going back to his father's house. And it doesn't really look good, which kind of goes with the practical reason, which is if his son goes back, especially if Abraham's not with him, I feel like it'd be very easy to be convinced to stay there.
Yeah.
Which is probably the chief reason he would have in mind. And you'll see this later on where, like, they end up hesitating to like let Rebecca go back. And so they keep asking him to stay and stay and stay and delay. We don't know anything much about Isaac's character, but maybe Abraham knows his son well enough to know that he may not be strong enough to, because Abraham's the one who was the God has directly interacted with him about this covenant. His son, I mean, I don't know, but he may be primarily like how he feels about this covenant may be primarily just from talking with his dad. And so he's not going to have, it's like, something your dad's passionate about, you may not have like the same passion for. We don't know how he feels about like this whole thing. And so it might be very easy for him to go back and be like, what's the big deal? I'm having the kids.
Yeah. Well, and the main thing that we get from Isaac throughout the whole story is that you cannot say that he is a man of action. He is very passive, to where pretty much every story he shows up in, he is passive. The only time I can think of where he directly takes action is actually going to be at the beginning of next week's section, where he goes and he implores God on behalf of his barren wife. And he takes the initiative and says, God, I need help. But pretty much any other story, even as we're going to talk about next week, he's going to make the same mistake as his father did in regards to lying about his wife being a sister. But even then, he doesn't take the initiative. It's only once people start asking around and they're like, hey, what's the deal with that Rebecca girl? And he's like, oh, she's my sister, to where Isaac is presented as a very passive character.
Yeah.
And so I think that there is a reality where he leaves the land and he just can be convinced to stay over there. And if you don't believe me, I think that you have this directly contrasted by Jacob, because Jacob is going to leave the land. He is going to go to where Laban's at, and he is going to stay there for a really long time. And so I think that in many ways, Jacob is going to do the very thing that Abraham was afraid Isaac would do.
I can see that.
Abraham cared so much about the covenant that he was like, no, do not let my son leave the land. Because like you're pointing out, that like reverses the momentum of the covenant, right? We did so much to leave that land and come here. We're not going back out. Whereas Isaac, again, he's passive, to where he just lets Jacob go. And so I think that that's probably part of it. And then in addition to that, I think that this also will tie into what responsibility the heirs of the covenant have, right? It is not, like, for the people who belong to God's covenant, it is not their job to leave the covenant to go and grab people. It is their job to invite people in to the covenant, right? And so it isn't Isaac leaving the land of promise to go get a wife for himself. It is the wife that God has provided being invited to step out by faith to join in the covenant, right? And so we're getting to see that Rebecca is going to enter into this covenant the same way Abraham did, to where it's all going to be by faith, to where Rebecca is going to have to just, like, she's going to have to hear what this servant says. Like, keep in mind, like it's really, if you view this whole story from Rebecca's perspective and from her family's perspective, it is wild. She woke up one morning and just went about all her daily activities. And then in the evening time, she went to go get water. She brings back the water. She finds this guy. She spends probably several hours giving water to this guy. They go to their house that night. They stay up late into the hours of the night with this guy explaining his story. And the next morning, she packs up her things and leaves forever. Like, that is a quick, like, just like, boom.
Yeah.
Quick transition. And she's being invited to live by faith, to where she is having to go with this stranger she does not know. And she's only doing this because this stranger has told a story which, by all evidence, points towards this being divinely orchestrated. And so she's having to step out by faith. And so I think that that also is relevant to where if Isaac was there, it wouldn't be as much faith, right? It'd be like, hey, by the way, I'm Isaac. I'm Abraham's son. I need a wife. And like, okay, she's at least seeing who her husband is.
Yeah.
Whereas in this moment, it's just some random servant showing up saying, my master sent me. This is what God did. And she's having to just step out by faith, right? And so I think that there's an element of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then also one other thing that I think, like the reason why he sends a servant instead of Isaac himself is, and this will tie into Jacob as well. Us humans have a nasty habit, and this ties into other stuff we talked about. We have an eyesight problem, right? We see things that are not good, and we call it good, right? You go back to Lot in Genesis chapter 13. He saw Sodom and Gomorrah, and he thought it looked like paradise, right? He compared it to the Garden of Eden. He's like, I love that land. I want it for myself, because our eyesight is very limited.
Yeah.
And that's why nowadays we live in a culture where nobody can get romance right because we prioritize all the wrong things, right? People will just chase after whatever looks attractive, right? And that's where there's all sorts of issues here. Whereas I think Abraham is being wise here, and he wants to avoid that. Because if he sends Isaac, like, or let me ask you this, another question. Why is it so important that Isaac not marry a woman from the land of Canaan? Is Abraham just a racist?
I mean, probably one of the single most important reasons is the fact that it's a different culture. And so just like, I mean, just kind of the same way that God will warn the Israelites later on is that when they marry into other cultures, it's going to distract them from following God. Abraham is supposed to be a keeper of the way of Yahweh. And if they start marrying into, Baal worshippers or whoever, that's going to have a negative impact on the covenant.
Yeah. And so the priority has to be devotion to God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if Abraham sent Isaac to go get a wife for himself, Isaac goes to the land of their fathers. He goes to the well. He sees all these women coming out. Do you think he's going to be thinking, okay, I want to pick the woman who is the most devoted to God? Probably not. He's going to be thinking, I want the woman who is most attractive to me. Yeah. And if you don't believe me, go read the Jacob story, because that's exactly what Jacob's going to do. He is going to go to the same area. He's going to go to probably the same well, and he's going to see Rachel, and he's going to be like, I like what I see. And she's going to be beautiful, and he is going to prioritize Rachel, and he's going to be married off to another sister who he does not view as beautiful, and he's going to neglect her entire life. And Rachel is the one he's going to be infatuated with until his death, and even after, literally unto his death, because even after her death, he's so infatuated with her that her two kids are his favorites.
Yeah.
And so us humans, we get infatuated with things because our vision is wrong, right? We see things wrongly, and we prioritize the wrong things. And so I think there is a reality where Abraham could send Isaac all the way back to the land of their forefathers, and Isaac would still end up picking the wrong girl. He would pick somebody who just did not have the right values. And he could pick somebody who was even worse than one of the Canaanites. And so I think he sends a servant because he knows that the servant will make the right choice.
Yeah.
Right. And
that's true.
And this is one thing where I think it is beneficial to I'm not saying we should bring back arranged marriages. I'm glad that we get to pick. I am so glad that I got to pick my wife, right? And that I got to like court her and like, do those things. But there is a benefit, like the benefit to arranged marriages is that if your family has the same values as you, they can help you pick somebody based on good values. And then once you're married, you can learn to love one another. Whereas in our culture, we've kind of flip-flopped it to where we've reduced love to just a feeling, and it's a feeling that comes and goes. And so people get married, and the moment those feelings go, they think they're out of love, where the real issue is that they've never learned that love is a choice that you make.
Yeah.
And the foundation of their love was on something that was never going to, like feelings are just gonna, like they come, they go, they come, they go, and attraction is gonna fade and charm is gonna fade. Whereas by sending the servant, he can ensure that the servant will prioritize the right things, and we're gonna see that with what the servant does. And so I think that's probably another reason. It's just he probably knows his son, because Abraham knows what it was like to be a guy wanting to marry, and he probably just wants to make sure that Isaac makes a smart choice. And so it's easier to just let the servant go do this, and the servant will bring back the one that God has chosen. And it just so happens that Rebecca will also be beautiful, which is a bonus, I guess.
Yeah.
And so he says to go, and it says that the servant took 10 camels from the camels of his master. He went with all kinds of good things of his master's in his hand. So he arose, he went to Mesopotamia. I forget what the literal phrase for Mesopotamia is there. I remember I didn't like that they translated it that way, because the literal translation is more meaningful to the story. It's Aram Naharaim. So it's Aram of the two rivers. So they translate that as Mesopotamia, but I just wanted to say Aram because whenever like when we think of Aram, we think of like Syria. Just to keep in mind, like it's a place that's going to continue to be relevant throughout the rest of the text of Scripture.
Yeah. Is that what Padan Aram means?
Padan Aram, it's the last part is the same, but it's I forget what Padan means.
Oh, okay.
But it's a slightly different location.
Gotcha.
But, yeah. So he goes up there to the city of Nahor, and so this is where Nahor and his family dwelt, and he goes there and he goes to the well, which is, I mean, if you're gonna meet women, that's the place to do it. You shouldn't be surprised whenever there's this recurring story throughout Scripture of people meeting their spouses at a well. That's because in ancient cultures, that was one of the only places where men and women could even interact. Because, I don't know, usually women would primarily just be hanging around with their families, and then they would go out with other women to the well at a certain time of day. And if you wanted to meet a woman, that's the place to do it. And so we're going to see that with Abraham's servant here. We're going to see that with Jacob. We're going to see that with Moses. And then, interestingly, we see that with Jesus. But Jesus is not, he's not there to meet a woman, he's there to meet a woman, but it's not to get married to her. It is to expose her for all of her marriages that she's had in the past. Yeah. And he does not meet her at the time of day whenever a bunch of women are going out to the well. He meets her at a time of day when nobody's supposed to be there, which, again, it shows a divine encounter to where it's all orchestrated. Yeah. And so there is this recurring theme throughout Scripture of people meeting at the well. And then you get the servant praying this prayer, verse 12. So, the women are coming out, they're at the well, they're drawing water, and he said, "O Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, please cause this to happen before me today, and show hesed to my master Abraham." Literally, it's, "and do hesed to my master Abraham." Mm-hmm. "Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the young man to whom I say, please let down your jar," or sorry, young woman, not young man, that would be a story. "Now may it be that the young woman to whom I say, please let down your jar, so that I may drink, and she says, drink, and I will give water to your camels to drink also. May she be the one whom you have decided for your servant Isaac. And by this I will know that you have done hesed to my master." All right. My question to you, Sean, was this prayer entirely random, or does this guy have something in mind? Why do you think it is that he chooses this particular sign as the confirmation?
Yeah. Well, there's probably something there about the fact that the conversation that, like, I guess, like, not pseudo conversation, but the hypothetical conversation he lays out, the woman's response to what he asked is something where she would be going above and beyond and like offering help to like also help water the camels and stuff. And so I think the point of like part of what he's saying is basically like this woman will be someone who is like a servant. Ironically, him being a servant too, but it seems to be emphasizing a quality about this woman.
Yeah. Well, it seems like he wants her to be somebody who goes above and beyond as well, because it would already be one thing to, just water a random stranger, right? Just some random guy comes up to you and says, "Hey, will you give me some water?" I mean, most people will be like, I don't know you. But instead she waters him, but then she says, "You know what? I'll water your camels also." He's got 10 camels. Do you know how much water camels drink? It's a lot of water. And so this is not a woman who's just willing to be inconvenienced for 30 seconds. This is a woman who is willing to be inconvenienced for hours and hours and hours, presumably, right? Unless she is just like super quick and like just like really buff and just like going back and forth. In reality, this is a very big commitment of time, which says a lot about the woman. And so there's really three things that as I've reflected on it, three things that I think are going on with the prayer. The first thing is probably the most straightforward, but he is putting everything in God's hands, not his. Even though God, like Abraham sent him on the mission, Abraham from the very beginning said, God will send his messenger before you and he will provide the wife. And so Abraham made it clear to the servant, God's going to be the one who provides. And he's not asking the servant to do it himself. And he even said that if the woman is not willing to go with you, you're free from this oath of mine. And so the servant stepped out here and he goes off, like from the beginning, he's putting his faith in what Abraham has said. He says, God, I'm going to entrust you to provide a wife for your servant Isaac. And so he desires the woman who is not right in his own eyes, but in God's. He says, like, he doesn't simply want to be like, okay, well, that woman looks good to me. I want that one. He's like, no, God, I want one that is good in your eyes. So he just says, can you orchestrate it so that this entire conversation happens exactly like I'm saying? Which leads to the second thing. He asks for a very specific sign, not like vague probability. Like he's asking for something that defies the odds. You might find a woman who's willing to give you some water, right? I mean, sure, right? If he's standing there, there's a bunch of women coming out. Hey, can you give me some water? There's probably a nice one out there who will say, oh yeah, sure, I'll give you water. There are very few who will see you with 10 camels and say, yeah, you know what? Let me devote the next several hours to just giving water to all of your camels as well.
Yeah, and them offer it, not like after he asked them to.
Yes. Yeah, it's like, so that is very specific. And so by adding that right there, he's making it to where it's not just about, oh, okay, well, like it is assessing the character. That's the third thing I'm going to highlight. But it really is divine confirmation that this is like a miraculous thing, like that God is doing this for him. Which then leads to the third thing, that the sign that he asks for is not rooted in the woman's outward appearance, but on her internal character. He does not say, hey, God, make her really good in appearance, make her very beautiful. Instead, he says, like he prays for somebody that is very diligent, very humble, who has like a servant's heart, who is very generous and shows hospitality to strangers. All qualities that would make, on one hand, just good qualities of a wife, but also good qualities of a servant of God. And these are, the qualities that you would not expect from the people of Canaan, based on how they've been characterized and stuff so far, and how they'll be characterized going forward into the rest of Torah and then outside of Torah. And so I think that's the whole prayer here. It's not him just like saying, he doesn't just want a magic trick. Like he's saying, God, I'm trusting you with this, but I want you to make your will clear to me. But I'm not asking for a random sign. I'm asking something that will produce a woman that is of such virtuous character that she is fit to be an heir of the covenant. If that makes sense. And so I think what he's doing here is like really smart, which again shows that this guy is just a really, really, really good servant. And so his whole goal is that he wants his decision to be based not on human preference, but divine appointment. Or I guess to use a more controversial term, divine election, right? He wants God to elect which woman will be the one, and then to God to identify her so that he can pursue that. And it's not simply him being led astray by his own preferences. It's God doing this.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I don't think so.
All right. So to go along with that, it says, before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, was coming out with her jar on her shoulder. This is cool because the way that the guy prayed this, he specifically was praying for something miraculous to happen, right? Something that just defied the odds. Surely there couldn't be a woman who is that kind. And before he even finishes talking, it happens, which just reinforces like the divine favor that's going on here, where God is divinely orchestrating it, because it would still be miraculous if the guy had waited there 10 hours, right? He could have waited there for days and days and days until that woman showed up, and it would have still been divine, right? It's like, okay, well, there's that woman. That's the one we're waiting for. But instead, he is still praying, and as he prays it, boom. Which is also fascinating, because that would imply that God began to answer the servant's prayer before he even began to voice it.
Yeah, because she had to walk there too.
Yeah, she had to be leaving the house with the jar, walking in that direction, and he's already praying for her, which is also really cool.
Yeah, and just throughout I think throughout this entire story, you kind of had this whole theme of like, I don't know if rushing is the best word, but like the whole thing is, it is all very like efficient, where it's like he goes there. Before he's even finished praying, she shows up, and then he goes and he's like, I'm not going to sit down and eat until I've explained what's happened. He explains. I'm kind of like already saying what we're going to talk about, but like, and the whole thing is they're trying to delay, but he's like, no, let's go. Like, let's go now, basically. Let's go now. Let's like, there's this whole theme of like, kind of like I don't know if rushing is the word, but like it is very efficient.
Well, it's very action focused.
Yeah.
And that's where I would even tie this to like the Gospel of Mark, to where whenever you look at the four Gospels, each of them tell more or less the same story, but they have different focuses. Matthew, like in general, there's always debate about everything in the Bible, but in general, people agree that Matthew is focused on Jesus as the Messiah. Luke is focused on Jesus as just a human in history. John is focused on Jesus as the Word made flesh, like the divine Son of God. And Mark is chiefly focused on Jesus as like the servant and like the suffering servant. And as a result, Mark's gospel, it is very short, very compact, very fast-paced. You have a lot of immediatelys in there. It's like, and immediately this, and immediately this, and immediately this. Yeah. The book opens up with the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and it culminates right after Jesus resurrects, to where the book is like as concise as possible to just get a bunch of action in there and then end. Yeah. And that's kind of how you feel with this, to where Abraham says, go do this. And then the servant makes this whole journey, but the journey is just summarized in like one verse. Oh, and he's there. And the moment he's there, he's praying. And the moment he finishes praying, she's showing up. And the moment she shows up, they have this conversation. And the moment they have this conversation, she gets to work. And the moment that she gets to work, he's watching. And the moment she's done giving all them water and he's done watching and he's come to his conclusion, he's asking her questions. And the moment that he stops asking her questions, she rushes home. And the moment she rushes home, all of a sudden they're at all of the house. And like it's very boom, 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 boom. It's very fast paced, despite being a very long story.
Yeah.
Which will then lead ultimately to the one part that is not fast paced, which we'll talk about in a second. But he interacts with Rebekah, and she fulfills all of the stuff to where she gives him water, she waters the camels, and I love that in the midst of all of that. Where is the verse? Verse 21. I like this verse. Meanwhile, the man was gazing at her in silence to know whether Yahweh had made his journey successful or not.
Yeah.
I just love this moment of, like, it almost feels too good to be true, to where you can't help but think that the guy's like skeptical, because he's like, wait, should I have prayed for something more specific? Because he's like, he hadn't even gotten to amen yet. And he, like, this woman just comes out and does all of it. And he's like just like watching her go back and forth. And he's like, was it really that easy? Like, he probably was expecting for this to be a much longer process.
Yeah.
And she just like came out to him and just like, oh, okay, this is happening right now. And I just love the imagery of like just him just gazing in silence. And he's just like, wow, okay. And then she comes up to him and he says, who are you? And she says, I am, I'm the daughter of Bethuel. And he's like, oh, okay, so you're from Abraham's family. Well, that is perfect, because Abraham's family is they're into each other. And so we move on, And she invites him to the house, and that's where you get to see the brother Laban. And you got to remember Laban because he's going to be important later on. Actually, real quick, did you pick up on how Laban is characterized in this chapter?
I don't actually think I did.
Let's see. Where's the okay? So, verse 28. Now the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. So she went and told her family, "There's this guy, and he says he's one of Abraham's servants, and he wants to come over here and stuff." Right? So she's informing him of all this stuff. Now Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran outside to the man at the spring. So in general, whenever you're introduced to a character in Scripture, it's always worth noting like the first things that they do or the first things that they say, because it'll tell you about their character. So Laban, he rushes out. And I want you to notice the first thing that he notices. Now it happened when he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's wrists. And when he heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, saying, "This is what the man said to me," he came out to the man. And behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. So what was it that he noticed first about Rebekah?
Like the gifts.
It was the gifts, and he noticed the gifts before he noticed the words. I just think that's significant because later on, Laban is going to be a very greedy individual. And so I think that you got this like little hint right here to where the thing that makes him run out there is that he sees like the first thing that attracts his eyes are the bracelets and stuff. He's like, oh, he sees that, and then he hears what she says, and he's like, ooh, okay. To where I don't know, like you. I think you're already supposed to be getting this uneasy feeling about Laban, to where in the midst of all of this, he wants to get his end of the deal.
Yeah.
And you're going to get that later on as well. To where this is actually a question that I had written down. But you'll notice that Bethuel, who is Rebekah's father, he is very passive throughout this entire scene, which is ironic. He's kind of fitting in the place of Isaac, who Bethuel and Isaac are cousins. Bethuel, he only talks one time, and that's in verse 50, when it says, "Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, 'The matter comes from Yahweh. We cannot speak to you bad or good.'" That is the only time Bethuel talks in the entire thing. When it's not Bethuel talking, it is Laban or Laban and his mother who are interacting throughout the text. I just find that interesting. And so I think that you're supposed to be feeling slightly uncomfortable about Laban already, to where he comes out and the first thing he notices are the gifts. And he ends up being the one who invites the guy to come and stay with them and everything. And so I think that you're supposed to be getting the hints right off the bat that Laban's kind of a sleazy character, but it's not so overt that you get the immediate red flags. It's more so that later on in the story, whenever Laban shows his true colors, you can look back and say, "Oh, okay, I saw that from the get-go."
Yeah, and he's not the focus of the story either. So.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's just kind of a little introduction. And so they do invite the servant over to the house, and they sit the guy down, and they lay the food before him, and he says, "I will not eat until I have spoken my words." And so we just get to see that this guy is dedicated to getting this job done.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that we know he was thirsty earlier, he's probably hungry now. He says, "Nope, I've got something I got to get done." And so he's just a great servant. And then we go into a pretty lengthy section here where the author just repeats the entire story. And you could easily just cut this out, just strip it out from the text, and you could summarize the entire thing and just say, "And he told them everything that had happened." Right? I mean, that'd be the easiest way to tell this story. And keep in mind that for an ancient author, they did not have Microsoft Word where they could simply copy and paste and then like edit a few words like we might do if we were trying to reach like a word count in an essay. That's not what they're doing here, right? He's having to handwrite all of this stuff. Why do you think it is that the author feels the need to repeat the entire story over again rather than simply saying, "And he told them everything that had happened"?
Yeah, I guess there's probably a couple reasons. We have to remember that before this, we just kind of saw everything unfold as it was narrated. Whereas this is really the chance that the servant himself is explaining the entire story from his perspective. So there's that. And then we also we kind of just see everything put together as far as like we see how the servant is putting together this case and just laying everything out, saying like, this is very clearly God behind the scene. And then also, again, since he's also talking to Laban and Bethuel and her mother, this is also like a case that he's ultimately trying like this is him laying everything out and basically without forcing them to like say yes to let Rebecca go.
Yeah. Well, I think that to that point, there's how do I even put this? If you just omitted this repeated story from the text, you could almost wonder, like if Laban and them just outright just agreed to send Rebecca away, you might be left with the impression that they're just irresponsible family members who just throw their daughter away, or like their sister or daughter away to the first guy who comes along, and you might wonder whether or not like what led them to do that.
Yeah.
Or if they rejected the offer, you might think that maybe the man left out certain details that might have compelled them to listen, in which case you might think that this guy was not a good servant. And so I think in repeating every single detail, you get to see not only why they end up responding the way that they do, but you also get to see how good the servant is at doing his job. And so I wrote down 5 different reasons why I think that it was necessary to repeat the story. I'll go through these pretty quickly because you already hinted at some of them. But the first one is that it provides a shift in perspective, right? The first time we read the story, that was the narrator simply telling us what had occurred. Whereas this time, we get to see the servant's interpretation of what had happened. And those things line up, but we get to see that the servant, he is very in tune to what's going on here. God has not shown up and just directly spoken to him like God might speak to Abraham, or later on he'll speak to Isaac or Jacob, but the servant is perceiving what God is doing, even though God is not outright speaking. So that's important. Secondly, it highlights the importance of the event. Anytime you see repetition in scripture, usually that's the author telling you this is a really big deal. We talked about this earlier on, but since Isaac is not the Messiah figure that we're waiting for, his main function in the story is just to basically pass the covenant along to a future seed. And with Abraham, his story began with him already having a wife. And so the dramatic tension in his story was, how are 2 old barren people going to have a kid? Whereas with Isaac, he's now almost 40 years old and he doesn't even have a wife yet. And so the tension in his story is, how are we going to get a wife? And so the repetition allows it to build up that tension, which leads to the third point, is that it does heighten the tension, right? As readers, we want to know what is going to happen. So far, God has made this man's way successful every step along the journey. And so we're wondering, is man going to mess this up? Because so far, when reading through Genesis, man has done a very good job of just kind of stepping in there and just screwing up everything. And so as readers, we want to know how it's going to resolve. And so by repeating the story, the author is keeping us on the edge of our seat, because we're just like, get to the point already. How are Laban and them going to respond? We want the guy to be successful, but there is always the chance that something comes in here and messes it all up. And so it kind of just gets us in this like nervous anticipation.
Yeah.
The fourth reason, and you brought this up, and I think this is probably the main reason the whole story is repeated, is just the rhetorical power that it serves, right? This guy is not simply blabbing on and on and on because he likes talking. That's what I typically do. This guy, he is talking with a purpose, and he's trying to build a case because he is a stranger from a strange land who they do not know, yet he is going to make an argument that they should send their daughter and their sister with him the very next morning, probably never to see her again. That's a really big request. And that should not be taken lightly, right? If some random stranger came knocking at my door and he was going to ask this about my child or something like that, I would want them to give an explanation. And so whenever you read the story, the guy is building a case to where he's having to take these people who have every reason to reject him and turn him away like a laughingstock, and he's trying to take away every excuse so that by the end of his story, they have no answer but yes. And so he's building a case the entire way, right? And so he's demonstrating how God orchestrated every single step. You'll notice that while I've been highlighting how faithful a servant this guy is, he does not take credit for a single thing. Every single thing he talks about is how God was behind it and how he is simply the messenger delivering to them what Abraham told him to do and what God told him to do. So that whenever they respond at the end, it is not about how they relate to him. It is about how much devotion they have to God and how much honor they have for Abraham. And so he's building a huge case there. He talks about the specificity of his sign so that they realize that this would not just be an everyday occurrence, but then he also talks about how quickly and precise the sign was actually fulfilled, right? I didn't even finish speaking and Rebecca came out and it all came according to plan, to where if you are them listening to this, you realize, okay, it seems like he's got a good argument here, right? And so this is going to all explain why by the end of the story, they say, this is from Yahweh, we can say neither good nor bad, right? To where you can tell that they're still uneasy and they do not want to say, yep, let's send Rebecca away, but they can't argue otherwise, because if his story is true, it's very clearly from God. And to add matters and to add a greater argument to this, Rebecca is there to corroborate all of it, right? Like she can say, yeah, this guy's not exaggerating, right? I saw him praying whenever I walked up. I gave him water, and then I did everything that he said. And so it's just like he's building a case so that they have no response in the end. And when it comes down to it at the very end, ultimately, he's not asking for their opinion. He's not asking for their interpretation. He's simply asking for their submission and their permission, right? So at the end, he doesn't say, so what do y'all think about that? He says, so God has clearly shown hesed and truth to my master Abraham. The question is, are you going to do the same? So it's not a matter of what is your interpretation. It's a matter of here's the facts. Here's the deal. Yes or no, right? And then the fifth thing that I think that the author might be doing here is that the author is subtly teaching us how to interpret life events, right? Like in many ways, we've talked about this already. The servant is kind of a stand-in for just a faithful follower of God and a faithful servant, to where we've gotten to see both how this guy's day transpired, and now we get to see his analysis of the day at the end of the night.
Yeah.
And so that kind of gives us an insight to where we can kind of figure out how to interpret and understand things that transpire even in our own lives, even though God is not directly speaking to us in the same way he might speak to Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Something I was going to add to that, to your last point there, something you said earlier kind of made me realize too, that to kind of go with like the whole, especially with the whole thing of the servant also being a stand-in for us or for Israel, we also see in this response, and really the whole entire story here, we see how good this servant hears as well. Like we've been talking about this theme of hearing throughout.
Yes.
And you see like, early Genesis, you see God telling Adam, do this, don't do this. Whereas you get to Eve, and she doesn't properly recite what God tells her. You go on, and there's this kind of theme of like those who don't hear well, they kind of twist what God says. Whereas in this entire passage, you have the servant who is told something by Abraham, and then later on he prays to God, and God answers him, and he hears God. He's like, "Oh, I hear what you're doing." Like God answers his prayer, and he acts promptly because he heard God. And so when whenever he's saying all these things and he's recounting them perfectly, there's no deviation from what Abraham told him and from how God answered.
Yeah.
He's also showing how he is good a hearer.
Yeah.
And so he hears God, he hears his master. And so in the same way, Israel's role is to hear God and to hear Abraham and hear Moses. And whenever they go to the nations, they should be able to explain their testimony, in a sense, tell their story in such a way where the nations have no option but to say, this is the God that we need to join.
Yeah.
In the same way that these people have no choice but to, they basically have no excuse, right? They can either reject God or they can join God. There really isn't like any in between. That's kind of how they're supposed to deal with the nations.
Yeah, it's almost like the slave is the first preacher.
Yeah. Like the way that Israel is supposed to behave in the world should give the nations no choice but to either accept or reject God.
Yeah.
And
that's true. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. To where he is quite literally doing what Israel's called to do, to where whenever they share what God has done in their life, they should be interpreting every single element, especially given Torah. They should be interpreting every element of their history through the lens of God's relationship with them, so that whenever people see what God is doing through them, they have no choice but to realize Yahweh is the God and we need to submit to him.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's kind of cool. And then even to add to that, it's cool that the servant is hearing God's voice without God even directly speaking.
Yeah.
Like he's hearing God's voice through God's actions, which I would argue that's what Moses is trying to get us to do through the text of Scripture. I mean, obviously God is speaking through Moses in Scripture, but we even talked about this in Genesis chapter 1, where he doesn't even call God by his name in Genesis 1, right? He just says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and he allows God to define himself by his actions. And it seems like that's almost what's going on with the servant here, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I think even in the New Testament, like the way that they talk about like reading the scriptures, they say like they talk about like they refer to it as like hearing from God, like
Yeah.
God spoke to us. Whereas like the idea is if he spoke, then we're supposed to hear.
Yeah.
So he spoke to us in the present day from the prophets of old, and so yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah. And so on the note of hearing, the servant is hearing really well.
Mhm.
And there are two other people who are here, and they are hearing, but they are not wanting to obey. Right.
Yeah.
And so you hear this response from Laban and Bethuel. Bethuel is the father of Rebekah,
Mhm.
and Laban's the brother. And they answered and said, "This word comes from Yahweh, so we cannot speak to you bad or good. So evil or good." And so they have this mixed response where they do admit, okay, if your word is true, that's definitely from God. And they should say, we can speak to you good, right? Like the idea is like, yes, awesome, we're behind this. But I think kind of understandably, they're hesitant to just like go along with it,
Yeah.
right? I mean, yes, they're in the wrong, but still, like you can understand where they're coming from because they kind of got blindsided by this whole thing,
Yeah.
right? They just welcome this guy in, and they're just giving him a meal, and then they just have their entire like world flipped upside down. And so they say, okay, we can't speak to you either good or bad. And so they say, Rebekah's before you, take her and go, so that they do ultimately submit to it. But then they do begin to kind of backtrack a little bit, and they say, well, hey, like, let her just stay another day, or you know what, stay 10 days. And the servant is wise enough to know where this is ultimately heading.
Yeah.
Because he knows, okay, 1 day turns to 10 days. I mean, just in their own sentence there, 1 day turned to 10 days. And so if he actually gives them that 1 day, well, all of a sudden 10 days is going to turn into 10 weeks and then 10 months. And then right now he's kind of got them to where they recognize from his story that God is undeniably at work. Whereas humans do have this nasty habit of, if we're given too much time, we will come up with excuses to get us out of obedience.
Yeah.
Right. This is the whole, well, what we were talking about before. Like, this is the whole, let's just wait and pray about it. Like us humans, we like, just trying to wait and justify disobedience.
Yeah. Or it's like, what's the story where Jesus is talking to a guy and he says like, let me go and like bury my like family, or I forget,
bury my father.
My father. And he's like, no.
Yeah.
Like,
He says,
now.
let the dead bury their dead. Yeah, because the whole idea is that we love coming up with excuses to not obey. And so these guys, they're saying, well, yeah, you can take her because obviously that's what God would say, but let's just let her stay a little bit. And he can tell that they're probably just trying to buy time. Okay, if we can get him to stay a little bit, maybe we can come up with an excuse for why she shouldn't go. And so he says, no, God has made my way successful so far. And so he again gives credit to God so that he makes it clear, if you stand in my way, you're standing in God's way. God's made my way successful so far. I was planning on being here a lot longer. This was a quick journey for me. Don't slow me down. Don't break my stride. Because if so, you're getting in the way of God. And so they eventually say, well, let's ask Rebekah. Rebekah comes in. She says, I will go with them. And so they do pray this prayer over her. May you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your seed possess the gate of those who hate him. In my translation, I translated it as the gate of his haters. And so do you recognize this language from our previous passage?
Yes. It was earlier in Genesis. I forget the number again, but it's like a couple chapters earlier.
It should be chapter 22.
22.
That's with the binding of Isaac. I think it's verse 17.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not the exact same language, but it's very similar language.
Yeah. By myself I have sworn, declares Yahweh, because you have done this thing and have not spared your son, your only one. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies.
Yeah, and so do you have any thoughts about that? Like, because that one says the gate of his enemies, and that's from God speaking to Abraham. And then this one says the gate of his haters, right? The gate of those who hate him. Do you have any thoughts about why they might use different language there?
Yeah, I'm not sure. At first I was thinking it was because of just the situation being different, but I guess in both cases it is referring to like a future seed possessing the gates, and so it may not be from like a covenantal standpoint. So I'm not really sure entirely.
Yeah, I just, it could just be just similar language and just a slight inflection there. I guess the term enemy is more objective than hate, if that makes sense, to where enemy is just anybody who is directly opposed to the covenant that God has made. Whereas the idea of possessing the haters or those who hate him, that would be the notion that's more inherently emotional, right? To where if you look at Jesus, I mean, he'll talk about loving your enemies as well. But I don't know. Like I guess like there could be like a nuance there to where they're speaking more according to like worldly terms, whereas God is speaking more according to, yes, like you will have victory over your enemies, like the enemies of the covenant, whereas they're thinking more personally about like personal animosity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't really have an answer there. Next question I want to ask you, just because this is something that stuck out to me. We know that Rebecca is the daughter of Bethuel, and I believe is it. I don't think we know the mom's name,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the mom and Bethuel do show up in the story, but they only show up very, very briefly, right? Bethuel, he only talks in one instance in the entire passage. That's verse 50. Whenever it says Laban and Bethuel answered and said, the matter comes from Yahweh, so we cannot speak to you bad or good. But then later on, the mother speaks with Laban in verse 55 and says, let the young woman stay with us a few days or even 10. Afterwards, she will go. And so to me, that sticks out just because Laban is talking in both of those situations. And so the author could easily tell the story in a way where he just highlights Laban, because Laban so far has been the main family member from Rebecca who is prominent in the story.
Yeah.
And so it's weird to me that Bethuel, like her dad is there, but he's not the one leading this conversation. And then after a little bit, it's not the dad who's speaking up again, it's the mom who speaks up. And so my question to you is, why do you think Bethuel is so quiet? Why do you think, or like quiet or passive? And why do you think the mother is the one who speaks up later on? And why do you think the author just has this focus on Laban?
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure, but it is possible that there could be some kind of like a what's the word? Almost like a sort of character contrast with someone else in scripture. Trying to think who it would be with though. Like
Yeah. So the way that I was kind of running with like my thought process here, I don't know if this is what you're hinting at, but I think that there could be a parallel if you consider just the familial relationships behind the scenes here.
Mm-hmm.
Bethuel is the cousin of Isaac, and later on in the story, Laban and Jacob are going to be foils of one another, to where Jacob's going to be this trickster character who's always one-upping people until he meets Laban, and then he's going to finally meet his match. And so you've got Jacob and Laban, who are both the sons of these cousins,
Mm-hmm.
right? And both Jacob and Laban are going to be trickster figures, and both Isaac and Bethuel are fairly passive figures who aren't exactly stepping into the forefront and doing like what their primary job would be in the situation.
Yeah.
And then whenever you go later on, you've got this kind of like if you contrast Isaac with Rebecca, Rebecca's actually going to be the more active one in the relationship, because she's going to be the one who actually helps Jacob manipulate Isaac into Jacob receiving the blessing. And so if you read that into this story here, Bethuel speaks up like Isaac at first, but he's still kind of passive. Oh, Yahweh said it. We can't say to you good or bad. So he basically just gives a non-answer, right? But then after time passes, you have Laban and the Rebecca stand in. So this would be Rebecca's mother. They step up and they're trying to manipulate the situation to try to get the servant to leave Rebecca. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so to me, I could almost see there being this parallel to where Rebecca's mom is equivalent to Rebecca herself, and then Bethuel is equivalent to Isaac, and then Laban is equivalent to Jacob, to where the author might be highlighting this like little parallel here. It'd be so subtle though that like you have to read really closely to get it, but there are times in scripture where it does do that, to where this could pay off later on, to where whenever you get to the Jacob story, you're like, oh wait, I've seen this before.
Yeah.
But other than that, I don't really have an answer. I don't know if that's what you were heading towards.
Yeah, something like that. I just get confused sometimes with a family.
It can be very confusing, especially because of how many interrelationships there are.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know. It just stuck out to me because you could easily tell the story without highlighting the father or the mother at all, because they're such like they're not prominent figures in the story. Like Laban is the one carrying the whole thing, and he's going to be prominent later on. And it's not like the text is being exhaustive, right? There were probably other people at this table as well.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it only like that it highlights them, like the dad there and the mom there, tells me that that's intentional by the author, and I'm just trying to figure out why. And my best guess is that there's just that parallel with the passive father, the manipulative mother, and then the trickster son, right? And like so, I think that's kind of maybe what's going on.
Yeah, and just this theme in general of like family strife that's been kind of riddled throughout Genesis as well.
Yeah. And so eventually they do let Rebecca go. She leaves. And then it says that Isaac had come from going to Beer Lahai Roi, for he was living in the land of the Negev. And Isaac went out to muse in the field toward the evening, and he lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and behold, camels were coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes and saw Isaac and dismounted from the camel. And so we have this moment where both of them lift up their eyes and they see.
Yeah.
Which reminds us of like Abraham and Lot back in Genesis 13, where they both lifted up their eyes and saw.
Yeah.
But with Abram and Lot, they were seeing different things. Lot saw Sodom and he took it for himself. Abram saw the land of Canaan and God gave it to him, right? In this moment, they lift up their eyes and they see each other. And I can't help but feel like that's just like slightly romantic, even though obviously this is an arranged marriage and it's a vastly different thing than our current culture and stuff. But something about that, it just feels so romantic to where this servant has accomplished his job and they lift up their eyes and they see each other. And Isaac, he gets up from meditating and he walks towards Rebecca. Rebecca gets off the horse and she she raises her veil and she heads towards him. And then there's this interesting interaction where she says, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "He is my master." And thus far in the chapter, Abraham is the one who the servant has called my master. It's the word Adonai. But now all of a sudden there's a shift. And it's no longer Abraham who's the master, it is Isaac. Why do you think that is?
As we've been seeing throughout really, I guess, this entire section, it just seems like the focus is now changing towards the new generation. And, Abraham's story is basically at this point completed. So he hasn't died yet, but he's, his story is completed. And so you just kind of have this shift where like now we're focusing on the generation of like Isaac and Rebecca. And so it kind of makes sense that would change.
Yeah, it makes it to where it's not surprising whenever you go to the very next chapter and only a few verses after this, Abraham does die. Because this really is it's the final thing that Abraham provided for his son so that his son can now officially be the heir of the covenant. And so I would say this is the moment where Abraham's story officially ends, to where whenever we're going to get to chapter 25 in a second, really it's just, just wrapping up final things so that we can get to Isaac.
Yeah, because the whole thing has been the promise of a seed. And so the first half was already fulfilled, which was Isaac. And then this is like with Rebecca now coming back and coming to Isaac, that's officially like the complete fulfillment of the seed.
Yes.
And so, it just makes sense that.
Yeah, because basically now Abraham has put Isaac in a place to where once we flip to chapter 25, Isaac's story is beginning where Abraham's began, right? He's a man, he has a wife, now they need to have a kid. And so Isaac has become the second Abraham. And so Abraham was the Lord, and now that the servant has fulfilled his mission, he realizes he has a new Lord, which is actually kind of like, there's just kind of this like beauty to it, to where the servant, he realizes how much faith Abraham was putting in him, to where in this moment he realizes, okay, it is no longer Abraham who's my Lord now. Because I've got you here, Isaac is my Lord now, which is cool. And it also highlights something that I think is unique. Abraham's final act in the story is an act that is fulfilled by faith. Because going forward, chapter 25, we're not going to see Abraham talk at all. We're not going to see him do anything. He's going to marry somebody and he's going to have more kids. But the last time Abraham speaks was at the beginning of chapter 24. And he was placing his faith in the fact that God would provide a wife for his son. And so the final thing Abraham does is place his faith in God. And it's not even him taking it into his own hands, right? Like chapter 22, he's the one who takes Isaac, goes up the mountain, lays him down, brings out the knife. But in this, he entrusts that to somebody else. And his final act is something where, like, it's not him pulling up himself by the bootstraps and living by faith. It is him causing another person to swear that they will live by faith as well. And he is trusting that God will provide. And he doesn't feel the need, to provide for his son. He is fully trusted that God will do everything needed to fulfill the covenant, which is really cool. And that's just like a really nice way to wrap up Abraham's story.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, that leads us to the final verse. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. But we know that this was in a few years because we know that he marries Rebekah when he's 40 years old. It's going to tell us that in chapter 25. And we know that she died, like that Sarah died when he was 37. And so all of this took place during those 3 years in between. And so there's that. And so do you have anything else you want to talk about in regards to chapter 24?
I don't think so.
All right,
I
cool.
think we're good.
So the last thing I want to talk about in regards to this chapter, and maybe me and you can both go back and forth on this just so it can go as quickly as possible, is I've mentioned already that I think that in many ways this servant is being presented as the ideal slave. And as I was reading through the chapter, I wrote down 18 different ways where this servant proves himself the ideal slave, just going through the story.
Yeah.
And so maybe you and I can just go back and forth, just reading each of these, because I don't know if any of y'all needs a good sermon. Here's an 18-point sermon that you can probably boil down to 2 or 3. But I really do like the servant in this story. And so the first way that the servant is an ideal slave, he's trustworthy. Abraham placed him over everything that he had, and we see that in verse 2. He went out with authority of the Father in service of the Son.
Mm-hmm. Oh, read the next one, or?
Yeah, go for it.
He submits to authority. He willfully accepts the job and takes the oath without resistance, in spite of the difficulty, restraint, commitment, and costs.
Thirdly, he seeks clarity in the mission. He does not raise questions to get out of the task, but only to clarify his master's will, and he demonstrates forethought in doing so.
Fourthly, he carries out the work diligently. He went about accomplishing the task fully prepared, equipped with everything he could supply to succeed.
Fifthly, he is strategic. He positions himself at the well at the right time, the ideal scene to fulfill his task both efficiently and effectively.
Sixthly, he depends entirely on God. Rather than depending on his own judgment, he entrusts the decision and success entirely to God from the get-go.
Seventhly, he relies on God's faithfulness. He appeals to God's hesed in both verses 12 and 14, not on personal merit, in order to make his way successful, a phrase that we see repeated 4 different times throughout the chapter. All of it is entirely rooted in God's covenant to Abraham.
Mm-hmm. Eighthly, he requests discernment. He asks for a specific sign in verses 12 through 14 so that he can rely on God's guidance, not personal guesswork. He seeks to discern God's will, not decide for himself.
Ninthly, he has very good priorities. He does not seek a charming or beautiful wife for Isaac, but a virtuous, kind, generous woman with a servant's heart, as we see in verses 13 and 14, one who demonstrates that qualities God himself possesses and God himself values.
Tenthly, he isn't hasty in his judgment. Though God provides an immediate answer to his prayer in verses 15 through 20, he watched silently to make sure this was from God, not mere coincidence, in verse 21. Though he wanted to get the job done as efficiently and effectively as possible, he prioritized getting the job done right over getting the job done quickly.
11th, he gives credit to God in private. His immediate response to success is to bow down in worship, as we see in 2 occasions, both in verse 26 and 27, and also in verse 52. He doesn't get so distracted by success itself that he loses sight of who gave him that success.
And 12thly, he resists distraction. He refuses to eat before addressing the task his master gave him in verse 33. He will not allow anything to distract him from the task given to him. He is diligent and focused.
13th, he is shrewd. When he recounts the story to Rebekah's family, he does so in a manner that almost guarantees his success. He shows how God clearly orchestrated every single thing and seeks his audience consent to facts, not interpretations or opinions of those events. He leaves little room for failure, and if he were to fail, he ensures that it would be no fault of his.
14thly, he gives credit to God in public. Not once does he highlight his own faithfulness or take credit for himself. Instead, all credit is concisely given to God 4 different times in verses 21, 40, 42, and 56.
15th, he is straightforward. He doesn't beat around the bush. He makes his purposes clear and their options very straightforward, as we see in verse 49. They can show hesed to Abraham as God has, or they can be opposed to God. He stands on business.
16thly, he has unwavering faith. If they deny him, he says that he will turn right or left in verse 49. One could suggest that he is calling their love, but either way, he is living by faith. Even if they resist, he is confident that God will provide elsewhere.
17th, he discerns and overcomes obstacles. Recognizing that tarrying might open the way for reconsideration, doubt, and a change of mind, he insists that they make a decision and act rather than push things off for a bit in verses 54 through 56. He is acting in promptness, utilizing clarity rather than allowing the flesh to plant seeds of doubt.
And finally, he remembers who he serves. He consistently calls Abraham his master, but in the end, he identifies Isaac as his master in verse 65. His mission was to, in the name of the Father, acquire and prepare a bride for his son. This is our mission too.
Yeah, so the reason I had both of us read that is because I did not trust myself to not elaborate on every single one of those, because I easily could. I could talk about this chapter for hours and hours and hours just based on those things right there, because the servant really is, he's just awesome. And if you're an ancient Israelite reading this, I think that you're supposed to learn, okay, well, how he served Abraham is how we are supposed to serve God. And as Christians, that's even more so the case, because you literally have a servant who is going out with the authority of the Father to prepare a bride for the Son, so that he can bring the bride back, and the Son can come and she can be radiant and ready and she can be unblemished. And that's what we're called to do as a church, right? We serve the Father in the name of the Son, and one day he's going to come back, and we are supposed to be like, we are the bride, but we're also supposed to equip the bride. So we're both Rebecca and we're the servant. And if you look at what they have in common, they both live by faith, and they're both trusting in what God has done. And so, to me, there's just such a beautiful message here. And then the way that he really wants to get the job done well. And you understand, like, you can see that he understands both Abraham's heart and God's heart. He understands the mission. He wants to get it done as quickly as possible, but he doesn't allow his promptness to make him sacrifice the quality of what he's doing.
Yeah.
To where he wants to make it clear, like, he wants to make it so that he gets the right woman. He doesn't want to just pick somebody. He says, God, I want you to pick the right woman. And he hypothetically could have been waiting for decades over in the land until God provided. But instead, God gave him very quick success. But then even then, every step of the journey, he's wanting to be thoughtful, and he's making sure that he's doing every step perfectly, so that by the time he comes back, it is the perfect, this is the perfect bride for Isaac.
Yeah. I think it's something we see throughout Scripture, even though, like, this is pretty starkly contrasted with the story of Abraham, where they're waiting like years and years for this promise to be fulfilled with like Isaac. The whole thing with God is, as I forget what book it's in, but it says, like, though it tarried, what's this? I think it's like in Jeremiah, where it says, like, though it tarry, like, do not wait.
Oh, it's Habakkuk.
Habakkuk, okay.
Yeah.
Where the whole thing is, like, God is, like, God has a timetable that he operates on, but at the same time, when God's, like, how do I put this? Like, there's a difference between God, like, waiting to do what he's going to do. Like with Abraham, he waited a long time. Like but it was like intentionally. Once it was the time to actually enact his word, he did it promptly. And that's just something we see throughout Scripture, where there's a difference between that and like putting things off. Yeah. Like the servant, once he knows, where, like, once he knows, that once he knows where to go, he goes. Once he's there, he prays. And once he sees this woman, he immediately tries to figure out if this is the right woman. And once he knows this is the right woman, he promptly, keeps on going. But he's never like, I'll just wait around and see if there's someone else. No, it's like he immediately is like discerning and trying to figure out. And once he knows, he runs with it. When that's kind of how people are throughout Scripture. There's a difference between that and like consciously putting things off.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna bring that up because modern day Christians, we love saying, "Oh, I'm just waiting on God," but the way that we use the term "waiting on God" is not how the Bible uses it. Yeah. We usually use the phrase "waiting on God" to push off walking in obedience to Him, and we'll just say, "Oh, well, I'm still praying about that decision," whereas this guy is like, it's active obedience. Right? When you're waiting on God, you are supposed to be actively serving Him, but you might be waiting for Him to give you greater insight or understanding for like a clear path ahead, but you're supposed to be actively serving Him. Whereas I can't tell you how many conversations I have been in with fellow Christians where I actually got in trouble over this one time because the person said, "Oh, well, let's just go pray about that." And I pushed back and said, okay, are we actually going to pray about this? Or is that simply your way of dismissing this as something that we're never going to talk about again? Like, are we actually, like, because if we're actually going to pray about it, let's do it. And let's pray. And then, like, as soon as we can, let's get back together and let's talk about it. If we're genuinely seeking wisdom. But if we're simply just, like, it becomes using the Lord's name in vain. You're just saying you're waiting on God to justify not walking in obedience to him. And that's a problem. Whereas this guy, he is not like that. This guy, he prays, and then, I mean, he was going to wait, but God didn't make him. God's like, here's your answer. But it's active obedience. And then the moment that God reveals something, he doesn't second guess it, and he doesn't do what Gideon does, right? Gideon, he says, hey, God, I want a clear sign. And God gives him the clear sign. And he says, can we reverse it now? It's like that's what the servant could do, right? It's like, okay, well, now let the woman do a somersault and 5 backflips and stuff. Like, he doesn't do that. The moment God gives him the sign, he says, okay, I got it. But he's also even not hasty there, to where he does still take time to assess to make sure that he's not being too hasty in his judgment, right?
Yeah.
But once he's confident, he goes for it. And so just great example. The verse you were talking about was Habakkuk 2:3. For the vision is yet of the appointed time. It pants towards its end, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay. The idea is that God doesn't work according to our own timetable, but he works to his timetable, and it's not going to be a moment late.
Yeah.
And so, which the reason we talked about that verse recently is because a lot of Jewish people will cite that verse in regards to the arrival of the Messiah, and they'll actually reverse the meaning of the verse, because they'll say that, yeah, God's behind schedule for when the Messiah was supposed to arrive, but it's all right. It'll come eventually, to where that's just not what the verse means. The idea is that it will tarry from our perspective, but God, he knows the appointed time.
Yeah. And that's like what we saw with Abraham.
Yes. And so we jump into chapter 25 now. This is our final chapter. We're covering verses 1 through 18. And the good news about this is that we can probably go through this relatively quickly, because verses 1 through 11 are just summarizing the death of Abraham and basically just what happened in the final, I guess, 38-ish years of his life, just very condensed. And then verses 12 through 18 are it's the Toledot Ishmael. It's the generations of Ishmael. And so verses 1 through 11, what do we see happen there?
Basically, Abraham gets a couple more wives, has some kids, dies. He gets buried next to Sarah. And then we just see generations of Ishmael. So Ishmael has kids who has kids who have kids who have kids.
Yeah. So my question is, we got a lot of focus on Abraham's life from the age of 75 through the age of, I guess it would be 137? Right? Where's he at? Like
because she was 127.
Yes. Right? Is that correct?
I think so.
Yeah, she was 127, so he was 137. So we get to see a lot of his life from age 75 to 137, or I guess to 140, because now that Isaac is married. So we get a pretty good, like, 65 years of Abraham's life that are summarized. But then these final years of his life, the final 35 years, we're just kind of fast forwarding through them. Why is that?
Because at this point we're pretty much past Abraham. I mean, really, we haven't been focused too much on Abraham for the last 2 chapters or so. We're moving on to Isaac, and so it kind of makes sense that the last chapter and a half has been bookended by Sarah's death and Abraham's death, because we're moving on to the next generation. Yeah.
So, and that's what the whole section that we're covering today is about. Ironically, according to the Torah calendar, next week's Parashat is called Generations, but it feels like that's a more apt title for this one. The reason why these Parashats are called by their titles is because it's the first Hebrew word that shows up in the section. And the next section begins with, these are the generations of Isaac. But it feels like that's a better title for this one, just because it's bookended by the death of the matriarch and the patriarch of the faith.
Yeah.
And so that seems like that'd be, it'd be fitting. And so, yeah, we're past Abraham's, most of his story. And so just to summarize Abraham's life real quick, we don't know anything about the first 75 years of his life. Other than that, he lived in Ur of the Chaldeans for a good part of it. But he was called by God at age 75. Ishmael was born at age 86. Ishmael was not 86. Abraham was born at 86. That'd be wild. That'd be like a Benjamin Button situation there.
Yeah.
But Abraham was 86 when Ishmael was born. Abraham was 99 when he was circumcised, which that sounds terrible. He was 100 when Isaac was born, which I find that also interesting that, like he's circumcised and the very next year Isaac is born, which I don't need to get into it, but like the imagery of that's kind of cool. Like the moment he cuts away from that appendage is like the next year it produces a child. He's probably somewhere between the ages of 103 and 107 whenever like Hagar and Ishmael are finally just like kicked out whenever they leave. He is probably somewhere between the ages of 115 and 130 during the binding of Isaac situation. We don't know how old Isaac was, but probably somewhere between mid-teens to early 30s. He's 137 when Sarah dies. He's 140 when Rebecca and Isaac get married. And then at some point between ages 140 and 175, Abraham does remarry. And we read about that. He marries this woman named Keturah, and he does have a bunch of kids with them to where that's why it's also like you can tell that the story is just not focused on it, because we spent so much time talking about the birth of Ishmael and Isaac, and so much attention is given to them. Whereas right here, it's like, oh yeah, by the way, whenever those kids sing the song like many sons had Father Abraham, that mainly comes from this. It's just like, it's from the section that most people forget about, because most people do not know that Abraham had another wife after Sarah died, and her name was Keturah, and they had a bunch of kids. But that did happen. And so she bore to him Zimran and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. And presumably they were married until the day of his death. And so if you actually do the math, we know that Isaac is going to marry Rebekah at age 40, and they're going to have their kids, Jacob and Esau, at age 20, which means that Abraham lived to see Jacob and Esau to the age of 15, which is just kind of cool to consider. We haven't gotten there yet because the story isn't telling things necessarily chronologically, but technically Abraham's death in chapter 25 takes place probably somewhere between verses 26 and 27 of chapter 25. Like if you were to actually like find a place to fit it chronologically into the story. And so there's the end of Abraham's story. Let me see. What questions did I have written down about this? Let's see. So the reason there's so little focus is simply because we're past the covenant part, right? Now that Isaac is married, he is the Lord of the covenant, and therefore the focus is going to be on him. And that's what we see in verse 11. Now it happened after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac lived by Beer Lahai. So Isaac, he receives the blessing, he receives the birthright. Jacob and Esau, they're going to be tussling over that, but Isaac receives all of it. Question for you, verse 6, or starting in verse 5. It says, and Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living. So do you interpret the concubines here to be a reference to Hagar and then Keturah? Or do you view this as being reference to other concubines that Abraham had, and then the sons would be other sons that are just not mentioned in the text?
That's a good question, actually, because I guess Ishmael did get sent east. I guess when I'd read it, I'd assumed it was other concubines.
Yeah. That's what I'm assuming, just because when you go back to chapter 16, it says that Sarai gave Abram Hagar as a wife. And then here it says that Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. And so it seems like they both did function as wives, in which case, like what's interesting about that is that Ishmael was not the son of a concubine. He was the son of a legit wife.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. And that means that Abraham was actually polygamous in like the basic definition of the term. Whereas, I mean, technically I would include concubines as being polygamous, but according to the basic definition of having multiple wives, Abraham did have multiple. And so, yeah, I would assume that concubines means that he had additional women in addition to all of this, which also makes things interesting because it makes you wonder, when did he acquire these concubines and when did he have these sons? Yeah. Like, did these sons always exist in the background? And we just never heard about them.
Especially because this is followed by the generations of Ishmael. It'd be kind of strange if he threw in here that the sons of concubines he sent eastward. And then he also says, now these are the generations of Ishmael.
Yeah. I just find it interesting because that's a part of Abraham's life that we never talk about. Again, you don't look at Abraham as like the ideal figure, but I don't know. Like, I don't think I've ever heard people mention this. I mean, I've read it before and it stuck out to me, but it's just, I don't know. I wanted to see what you thought there because I do interpret that as being, so not only did he have Hagar and Sarah and Keturah. Keturah is this is at least justified because Sarah is dead and Hagar is gone. So it's probably fine for him to remarry Keturah at this point. But the concubines, not a good look, but the Bible isn't endorsing it. It's simply saying that as a matter of fact, that's just how it was. And to me, I just find it curious to wonder, did these sons exist? Like we have no way of knowing, but did the sons already exist prior to the birth of Isaac? Or did he have all these sons later on? I would assume that they already existed, which just, I don't know, it creates another level of depth to the whole story because that means he did have other sons, but he was determined to have one through Sarah, which makes things even more dramatic whenever she says through Hagar instead.
Yeah.
Because it makes it to where Ishmael, from the get-go, he is being distinguished from the other sons of the concubines to where he does have this elevated status already.
Oh,
You know what I mean? To where, like, if those sons already existed throughout the whole story, like, I think in our heads, we typically, I don't know, maybe this is just me, I typically view Ishmael as being what you would consider like a son of like a concubine, like to where he's like a lesser son. But in reality, that could explain why there's so much attention focused on Ishmael, because he just lives in this weird limbo space to where he is the son of a legit wife, but he's not the firstborn because he's not the one that God provided.
Yeah.
And that could just, I don't know. I could see that being something there. That just stuck out to me. Do you find any significance of the fact that both Isaac and Ishmael came to bury their father together? Because it doesn't mention the sons of the concubines. And it doesn't mention the sons of Keturah. It simply mentions Isaac and Ishmael. I imagine that the other ones were there, but for some reason it draws attention to Isaac and Ishmael alone. Do you think there's anything there?
I don't know. Other than just the fact that what we just talked about is that they're the only two. I guess they're the only two really like legit sons in that. Oh no, I guess these other sons.
The sons of Keturah.
I guess the sons of Keturah also are. But there probably is some significance in the fact that they came together to bury their father. Them being like the two first legit sons. I don't know specifically what the significance would be.
Yeah, I didn't know if it would just be like the idea that they maybe had like a okay relationship going forward. Like they're they're not at war with one another. There is going to be enmity later on between their peoples, I guess, but they seem to be on decent terms. Like the fact that they can get together and honor their father together, I guess.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Doesn't a similar thing happen with Jacob and his sons? Like they kind of come together and like bury him and stuff.
Yeah. Well, it seems like for every passing of the generation, the sons all do come together to do this, because Jacob and Esau will do the same for Isaac, and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, this leads us to the generations of Ishmael. I've asked this question before. Why do you think there's so much attention devoted to Ishmael?
I guess to add to what we just talked about, it seems like he is a legit son of Abraham. I mean, he's not the son of promise, but he is still a son that even in scripture, God did promise that he would make a mighty nation. And so I think for that sense, I think that's probably the main thing.
Yeah. I don't have an answer there. So he has 12 sons, right? And these are the 12 princes that were promised earlier on in scripture. It doesn't say 12 princes in this passage, right?
Yeah, it does.
Oh, it does in verse 16.
This is where it says it.
Yeah. Well, it said it back in chapter 17 as well. Back whenever God made the covenant of circumcision, remember Abraham had said, "May Isaac live before you." And verse 19, it said, "No, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. You will call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him." Verse 20, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless you exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes."
Okay.
And so it had said that earlier on, but then it reaffirms it here to where we get to see that what God promised has come to pass. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, if anything, that just reaffirms to us that what God promised to Isaac will also come to pass. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but think that, like, it seems to me that Ishmael is being presented as analogous to Israel, because he has 12 princes, whereas they're going to have 12 tribes. And
Yeah. Well, it says 12 princes according to their tribes too.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it seems like it'd be like the 12 patriarchs of the 12 tribes. I don't know what to do with that. Just because Ishmael he's not like a major player later on in the Bible, right? Like to me, all of the focus on Ishmael would make a lot more sense if he was like the patriarch of the Assyrians or the Babylonians or Rome or something like that. But instead he's not. And I just don't know what to necessarily do with that information.
Yeah, because I mean, really, the only name that sticks out to me in the Sons is Kedar.
Yeah, and
Kedar is mentioned. I mean, he's not a significant figure, but
Yeah.
he's like mentioned in Psalms, like the tents of Kedar.
Yeah.
And I think historically speaking, he's actually Kedar is actually a significant, but other than that,
yeah. And then and if you go back to Abraham, the only name that really sticks out to me of his sons of Keturah is Midian, and that's because the Midianites are going to be really relevant later on.
yeah,
And so you got to realize that they are distantly related to the people of Abraham as well. But yeah, I don't know. So there's how that story ends. And it says they dwelt from Havilah to Shur, which Havilah, you'll remember that way back at the Garden of Eden.
yeah,
And it seems like in general they're living in the Arabian Peninsula area, which is east of Egypt as one goes towards Assyria. And he settled in the face of all his brothers. And even when it says Shur, which is east of Egypt, the literal wording there is it is in the face of Egypt. I don't know why they translate it as east there. But it's the same phrase that you see when it says he settled in the face of all his brothers. And that calls back to what God had promised to Hagar.
yeah,
Where his hand would be against everybody and everybody's hand against him, and he would dwell in the face of his brothers. I don't know what that... I'm assuming it just means like enmity. But I don't know. He settled like... How do you interpret that phrase?
I'm not sure. Unless there is some kind of geographical term, like in the same way that we say like we translate like the presence of is like in the face of, or vice versa. Like where the Hebrew would say like the face of, we translate as like presence.
Yeah.
Unless there's something going on there where like face of is or like east, or like facing has to do with like being east with like the sun or something, but unless it's that,
I have no idea.
I'm not sure.
All right, cool. Well, is there anything else you want to add to this discussion in regards to chapters 23, 24, and the first half of 25?
Not really. I was gonna say like a very small thing, that it says Abraham was gathered to his people, and I was just thinking maybe that meant that like by this point there were probably more people that were buried in the cave.
Oh, maybe so. Yeah.
It says that he was gathered to his people, and then it says he was buried with his wife.
Yeah. I think the phrase gathered to his people in general is just like a way that they...
It's like a phrase.
Yeah, that they just refer to burial, because in general you're being gathered to your family. And so it could be that there's other people buried there, or it could just be that they're just employing the phrase because that's how they would say it.
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah.
Other than
Oh,
that-
it's also worth pointing out, I guess, verse 8. And Abraham breathed his last and died in good old age, and a man full of days. The phrase here, it actually directly calls back to what God had promised him in chapter 15, I believe it was. What it says is, and Abraham breathed his last and died in good gray hair and satisfied. Which I like that so much more. Like, I wish that we just did literal translations more often, because it says he died in good gray hair and satisfied. And that calls back to what God had said in Genesis 15, whenever he had said that Abraham's descendants would go down to dwell in a land that was not theirs, and they would be afflicted. But he says, but as for you, you will die of a good old age, or like in good gray hair, I believe it is.
Yeah, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You'll be buried at a good old age.
Yeah. What verse is that?
15. So 15.
15. Where's it at? Oh yeah, you will be buried in good gray hair. Yeah, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried in good gray hair. So that calls back to that. God had said he was going to die in good gray hair, and he died in good gray hair. It just means good old age, but
Yeah.
I like the physicality of it, where it's like, you get the idea that it's talking about him being old, but good gray hair, it's like the impression of just you've been old for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you've had that gray hair for a while, and you're not dying of like, in battle or something like that. You're just dying at a good old age. Like, so I get why they translate it that way. I just like the physicality of Hebrew better. And so
I agree.
it says he died at a good old age, or good gray hair, and satisfied. And I thought that was cool. So cool.
Yeah.
On that note, Abraham dies. God bless Isaac, and we'll be picking up next week talking about the generations of Isaac and the birth of Jacob and Esau, and it will be a very good discussion, I believe. Do you have anything you want to add?
I don't think so. I think we're good.
All right. Well, thank you for watching this. Until next time, my name is David Tate.
And I'm Sean Powell.
And this has been Talking Through the Text. We will see y'all later. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Talking Through the Text. If you enjoyed this episode and want more like it, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who might enjoy it too. Stay tuned for more episodes coming your way. Until next time, keep talking through the text.